Welcome to another soothing episode of Boring History for Sleep. Tonight, we'll explore some of the less glamorous aspects of colonial life, beginning with why it was particularly unpleasant to be a colonial settler. As we journey through time, we'll uncover the mundane hardships and tedious details that made early American life far from the romanticized version often portrayed in history books. Our historical lullaby will take us through the daily struggles of colonial settlers, from battling harsh weather conditions to dealing with primitive sanitation. We'll also touch on the monotonous diets, lack of modern conveniences, and the constant threat of disease that plagued these early communities. So lie back, close your eyes, and let the dull drone of colonial hardships lull you into a peaceful slumber. Remember, history may not always be exciting, but it can certainly be sleep-inducing when presented in just the right way. As we delve into the harsh realities of colonial settler life, let's begin with one of the most fundamental aspects of human existence: housing. The dwellings of early colonial settlers were far from the cozy, well-insulated homes we enjoy today. In fact, they were often little more than rudimentary shelters that barely protected their inhabitants from the elements. Upon arrival in the New World, many settlers found themselves living in temporary structures like caves, dugouts, or crude lean-tos. These makeshift homes offered minimal protection from rain, wind, and the biting cold of winter. Imagine trying to sleep on a damp earthen floor, with only a thin layer of straw between you and the ground, while the wind howls through gaps in your hastily constructed walls. As settlers established themselves, they began to construct more permanent dwellings. However, these early houses were still far from comfortable by modern standards. The most common type of colonial home was the simple one-room structure, often referred to as a hall and parlor house. These modest dwellings typically measured around 16 by 20 feet, barely larger than a modern living room. The walls of these houses were usually made from rough-hewn logs or wooden planks, with gaps between them stuffed with mud, moss, or animal hair for insulation. This primitive form of weatherproofing was far from perfect, allowing drafts, insects, and even small animals to find their way inside. During harsh winters, frost would often form on the interior walls, and residents would wake up to find a thin layer of snow on their bedding. Roofs were typically thatched with reeds or covered with wooden shingles. While these materials provided some protection from rain, they were prone to leaks and required frequent repairs. Thatched roofs also posed a significant fire hazard, especially given the prevalence of open hearths and candles for lighting. Speaking of lighting, colonial homes were often dimly lit at best. Windows were small and few in number, both to conserve heat and because glass was expensive and difficult to obtain in the colonies. Many settlers used old paper or animal hide stretched across window openings instead of glass, which let in some light but offered little in the way of a view or fresh air. The floor of a colonial home was usually bare earth, perhaps covered with rushes or straw. In more established settlements, wooden plank floors became common, but these were often rough and uneven, with gaps between the boards that allowed drafts to seep up from below. At the heart of the colonial home was the fireplace, which served as both the primary source of heat and the cooking area. These massive stone structures dominated one wall of the house, often taking up a quarter of the available floor space. While they provided essential warmth and a place to prepare meals, they were also incredibly inefficient. Much of the heat escaped up the chimney, leaving the far corners of the room cold and drafty. Sleeping arrangements in these cramped quarters were far from private or comfortable. Most family members shared a single room, with parents and children often sleeping in the same bed or on pallets on the floor. Bedding consisted of straw-filled mattresses, which were havens for fleas, lice, and other pests. Blankets were typically made of rough wool, which could be itchy and uncomfortable. As families grew and prospered, they might add a second story or additional rooms to their homes. However, even these expanded dwellings lacked many of the amenities we take for granted today. There was no indoor plumbing, meaning that all water had to be carried in from wells or streams, and waste had to be disposed of manually, usually in outdoor privies that were breeding grounds for disease and unpleasant odors. The lack of proper sanitation and ventilation in colonial homes contributed to the spread of illness. In the close confines of these dwellings, diseases could quickly pass from one family member to another. The smoky air from the constantly burning fireplace often led to respiratory problems, especially during the long winter months when doors and windows remained tightly shut against the cold. Maintaining these homes was a constant battle against the elements and pests. Roofs needed regular patching, walls required remudding to fill gaps, and floors had to be swept daily to remove the accumulation of dirt and debris. Mice, rats, and insects were constant unwelcome guests, attracted by the warmth and the storage of food supplies within the home. Despite these challenges, colonial settlers took pride in their homes and worked tirelessly to improve them. As communities grew and trade networks expanded, more sophisticated building materials and techniques became available. By the late colonial period, some wealthy settlers were able to construct grand houses that rivaled those in Europe. However, for the majority of colonists, home life remained a far cry from modern comforts well into the 18th century. It's worth noting that the quality of colonial housing varied greatly depending on factors such as location, social status, and the specific time period within the colonial era. Settlers in more established towns generally had access to better materials and skilled craftsmen, while those on the frontier often had to make do with whatever resources were at hand. In conclusion, the housing conditions of colonial settlers were a far cry from the comfortable homes we enjoy today. From the cramped, drafty one-room dwellings to the constant battle against the elements and pests, early American settlers faced numerous challenges in creating a safe and comfortable living space. The next time you curl up in your warm, well-lit home, take a moment to appreciate the stark contrast between your living conditions and those of our colonial ancestors. Their perseverance in the face of such hardships played a crucial role in shaping the foundations of modern American society. As we delve deeper into the hardships of colonial settler life, let's turn our attention to one of the most fundamental aspects of human existence: food. The culinary experiences of early American settlers were far from the comfort and variety we enjoy today. In fact, their daily struggle to put food on the table was a constant reminder of the harsh realities of their new world. Imagine, if you will, waking up each morning not to the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and toast, but to the gnawing pangs of hunger and uncertainty about where your next meal might come from. This was the reality for many colonial settlers, especially during their first few years in the New World. Upon arrival, settlers quickly realized that the bountiful land they had envisioned was actually a wilderness that required immense effort to tame and cultivate. The first challenge they faced was simply finding enough to eat. Many of the crops and animals they were familiar with from Europe didn't exist or thrive in their new environment. Initially, settlers relied heavily on what they could hunt and gather from the surrounding forests. Wild game such as deer, turkey, and rabbit became staples of their diet. However, hunting was not always successful, and the unpredictable nature of wild game meant that settlers often went to bed with empty stomachs. Foraging for edible plants and berries supplemented their diet, but this too came with risks. Many settlers lacked the knowledge to distinguish between safe and poisonous plants, leading to instances of illness and even death from consuming the wrong vegetation. As time passed and settlements became more established, agriculture began to play a crucial role in the colonists' food supply. However, farming in the New World presented its own set of challenges. The soil and climate were different from what they were accustomed to in Europe, and many of their traditional farming methods proved ineffective. Corn or maize became a saving grace for many settlers. Native Americans introduced this versatile crop to the colonists, teaching them how to cultivate and prepare it. Corn could be ground into meal for bread, used to make porridge, or even fermented into beer. It became such an important staple that it was often referred to as Indian corn in recognition of its origins. Other crops that eventually became staples included beans, squash, and pumpkins. These vegetables, along with corn, formed what became known as the Three Sisters method of companion planting, another agricultural technique learned from Native Americans. Despite these agricultural advancements, food scarcity remained a constant threat. Crop failures due to drought, pests, or disease could spell disaster for an entire settlement. The infamous starving time at Jamestown in 1609-1610 serves as a stark reminder of how precarious the food situation could be. During this period, over 80% of the colonists died from starvation and related diseases. Even when food was available, the diet of colonial settlers was far from varied or nutritionally balanced. A typical meal might consist of cornbread, salt pork, and whatever vegetables were in season. Fresh fruit was a rarity, often reserved for special occasions or preserved as jams for the winter months. Speaking of preservation, this was another significant challenge for colonial settlers. Without modern refrigeration, keeping food from spoiling was a constant battle. Salting, smoking, and pickling were common methods used to preserve meat and vegetables. However, these techniques often altered the taste and texture of food, making meals less palatable. Dairy products were particularly difficult to keep fresh. Milk would spoil quickly in warm weather, so it was often consumed as cheese or butter. Even then, the quality of these products was far from what we're accustomed to today. Rancid butter and moldy cheese were not uncommon on colonial tables. The lack of variety in their diet led to nutritional deficiencies that we would find shocking today. Scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C, was a common ailment among settlers, especially during winter months when fresh fruits and vegetables were scarce. Other deficiency diseases like pellagra, resulting from a lack of niacin, were also prevalent. Meal preparation itself was a time-consuming and labor-intensive process. Cooking was done over open hearths, which required constant attention and skill to maintain the right temperature. Women and children spent hours each day preparing meals, grinding corn, baking bread, and tending to cooking fires. Water, which we take for granted today, was another source of concern for colonial settlers. Clean drinking water was not always readily available, and contaminated water sources led to outbreaks of diseases like dysentery and typhoid fever. As a result, many settlers turned to alcoholic beverages like beer and cider as safer alternatives. The hardships of securing and preparing food had a profound impact on colonial society. Meal times became central to family and community life, with the act of sharing food taking on almost sacred significance. Hospitality, even in times of scarcity, was considered a moral obligation. Seasonal changes dramatically affected the settlers' diet. Summer and fall brought relative abundance, with fresh vegetables and fruits available. Winter, however, was a time of scarcity and monotony. Stored root vegetables, dried beans, and salted meat formed the bulk of winter meals, often leading to what we now recognize as seasonal affective disorder. As settlements grew and trade networks developed, some variety was introduced to the colonial diet. Imported goods like sugar, spices, and tea became available, though they were often expensive luxuries reserved for the wealthy or special occasions. The relationship between colonists and Native Americans significantly influenced colonial cuisine. While initial interactions were often marked by conflict, there was also a crucial exchange of knowledge about local foods and cooking methods. Many of the survival techniques and staple foods that allowed the colonies to persist came directly from Native American traditions. In conclusion, the food situation for colonial settlers was far from the cornucopia of plenty that modern Americans enjoy. It was a daily struggle marked by uncertainty, scarcity, and hard work. The simple act of putting food on the table required knowledge, skill, and often a good deal of luck. Next time you sit down to a varied and nutritious meal, take a moment to appreciate the stark contrast between your experience and that of the early colonial settlers. Their perseverance in the face of such challenging conditions laid the foundation for the diverse and abundant food culture we enjoy today. As we delve deeper into the hardships of colonial settler life, we come face to face with one of the most terrifying and relentless enemies they encountered: disease. In an era before modern medicine, even the simplest of ailments could prove fatal, and the New World presented a host of unfamiliar illnesses that decimated settler populations. Let's begin with one of the most notorious killers of the colonial era: smallpox. This highly contagious virus ravaged communities, leaving death and disfigurement in its wake. Settlers arriving from Europe often unknowingly carried the disease, which spread like wildfire among both colonists and Native American populations who had no immunity. Picture, if you will, the horror of watching your loved ones develop painful fluid-filled blisters all over their bodies, accompanied by high fever and severe body aches. The lucky survivors were left with deep, pitted scars, a permanent reminder of their brush with death. Entire villages could be wiped out in a matter of weeks, leaving behind ghost towns and mass graves. But smallpox was far from the only threat. Malaria, a parasitic infection transmitted by mosquitoes, was another constant danger in the warm, humid climates of the southern colonies. Settlers would experience recurring bouts of high fever, chills, and debilitating fatigue. The disease not only endangered lives but also severely hampered productivity, making it difficult for colonies to thrive. Imagine trying to clear land, build shelter, or tend crops while battling waves of fever that left you too weak to stand. Many settlers succumbed to malaria year after year, their bodies gradually worn down by the recurring illness. Yellow fever, another mosquito-borne illness, struck fear into the hearts of colonists, particularly in port cities. Outbreaks could occur suddenly, turning bustling towns into nightmarish scenes of suffering. Victims would experience high fever, muscle pain, and nausea, often progressing to jaundice, hence the name yellow fever. In severe cases, internal bleeding would cause victims to vomit partially coagulated blood, a terrifying symptom known as black vomit. The sight of this alone was enough to cause panic and mass exoduses from affected areas. Entire families could be wiped out within days, leaving behind orphaned children and devastated communities. Dysentery, often called the bloody flux, was another common and deadly affliction. Caused by contaminated water and poor sanitation, this intestinal infection led to severe diarrhea, often containing blood and mucus. The rapid loss of fluids and electrolytes could kill within days, especially in children and the elderly. Imagine the misery of colonial settlers, racked with abdominal pain and constantly running to crude outhouses, all while trying to maintain their daily duties. The weakness and dehydration caused by dysentery made victims easy targets for other opportunistic infections, creating a vicious cycle of illness. Pneumonia, too, was a silent killer that stalked the colonies. In an age before antibiotics, a simple chest cold could quickly develop into a life-threatening infection. The harsh winters, combined with poorly insulated homes and malnutrition, made settlers particularly vulnerable to respiratory illnesses. Picture huddling around a meager fire, listening to the labored breathing of your family members, wondering if they would survive the night. The feeling of helplessness as you watched loved ones struggle for each breath must have been overwhelming. Let's not forget about the everyday injuries that could lead to deadly infections. A simple cut from an axe while clearing land or a splinter from building a home could introduce bacteria into the body. Without proper medical care, these wounds often became infected, leading to sepsis. The sight of an infected wound slowly spreading, the skin around it becoming red, swollen, and hot to the touch, was a source of constant anxiety. Settlers lived with the knowledge that even minor injuries could lead to amputations or death. Childbirth, a natural process that today is generally safe in developed countries, was fraught with danger in colonial times. Many women died from complications during labor or from postpartum infections. The lack of proper hygiene and medical knowledge meant that both mothers and infants were at high risk. Imagine the fear and uncertainty that must have gripped expectant mothers, knowing that bringing new life into the world could very well cost them their own. The joy of pregnancy was often tempered by the sobering reality of high maternal and infant mortality rates. Nutritional deficiencies also played a significant role in the settlers' susceptibility to disease. Scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C, was common among those who didn't have access to fresh fruits and vegetables. Symptoms included fatigue, joint pain, and bleeding gums, which could lead to tooth loss and even death if left untreated. The constant struggle to maintain a balanced diet in a new and often harsh environment meant that many settlers were living in a state of chronic malnutrition, weakening their immune systems and making them more vulnerable to various illnesses. Mental health, though not well understood at the time, was another silent struggle for many colonists. The isolation, constant threat of danger, and the grueling work of establishing a new life in an unfamiliar land took a toll on the settlers' psychological well-being. Depression, anxiety, and what we might now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder were likely common, though rarely acknowledged or treated. As we reflect on the myriad health challenges faced by colonial settlers, it's important to remember that they faced these threats without the benefit of modern medical knowledge. Their resilience in the face of such overwhelming odds is a testament to the human spirit and the drive to create a better life, even in the most daunting circumstances. The next time you reach for an over-the-counter pain reliever or visit a doctor for a routine checkup, take a moment to appreciate the medical advancements that have made our lives so much safer and more comfortable than those of our colonial ancestors. Their struggles with disease and injury serve as a stark reminder of how far we've come in our battle against illness and how fortunate we are to live in an age of modern medicine. As we delve deeper into the hardships of colonial settler life, let's explore the grueling work that dominated their daily existence. The romanticized notion of pioneering a new world often overlooks the backbreaking labor and constant struggle for survival that these early settlers endured. From dawn to dusk, colonial settlers toiled relentlessly to establish their homesteads and communities. Their work was not only physically demanding, but also fraught with dangers and uncertainties. Let's examine the various aspects of their labor and why it was far from the idyllic adventure some might imagine. First and foremost, land clearing was a monumental task that greeted every settler upon arrival. The dense forests of North America presented a formidable challenge. Armed with nothing more than axes, saws, and their bare hands, settlers had to fell towering trees and remove stubborn stumps to create arable land. This process was not only exhausting but also perilous. The risk of injury from falling trees or mishandled tools was ever present. Many settlers suffered severe wounds or even lost limbs during the land clearing process. The work was slow and tedious, often taking years to clear enough land for a modest farm. Once the land was cleared, the arduous task of farming began. Without modern machinery, every step of the agricultural process was labor-intensive. Plowing the land required immense physical strength, as settlers guided heavy wooden plows pulled by oxen or horses through stubborn soil. Planting crops was equally demanding. Seeds were sown by hand, a time-consuming process that required careful attention to spacing and depth. Watering was often done manually, carrying heavy buckets from nearby water sources to nourish the growing plants. The constant battle against weeds was another source of endless toil. Without herbicides, settlers spent countless hours bent over their fields, pulling weeds by hand to protect their precious crops. This backbreaking work often led to chronic pain and physical deformities over time. Harvesting was perhaps the most intense period of the agricultural cycle. Entire families, including young children, would work from sunrise to sunset to gather crops before they spoiled. Using simple tools like scythes and sickles, settlers would cut down wheat, corn, and other grains by hand. The harvested crops then had to be processed, another labor-intensive task. Thrashing wheat, for example, involved beating the harvested stalks to separate the grain from the chaff. This was often done by hand with flails or by having animals trample the wheat on a thrashing floor. Beyond farming, settlers had to construct and maintain their own dwellings. Early homes were often simple log cabins, built using felled trees from the land clearing process. These structures required constant upkeep, as gaps between logs needed to be regularly filled with mud or moss to keep out the elements. The interior of these homes was far from comfortable. Dirt floors were common, and furniture was often rudimentary, crafted by hand from available materials. The lack of proper insulation meant that settlers endured sweltering summers and freezing winters within their humble abodes. Water procurement was another daily chore that consumed significant time and energy. In the absence of indoor plumbing, settlers had to haul water from nearby streams or wells for drinking, cooking, and washing. This task often fell to women and children, who might make multiple trips a day carrying heavy buckets. Laundry, a task we take for granted today, was an exhausting ordeal for colonial settlers. Clothes were washed by hand in large tubs, using homemade lye soap that was harsh on both fabrics and skin. The process of scrubbing, rinsing, and wringing out heavy, waterlogged garments was physically demanding and time-consuming. Food preservation was crucial for survival, especially during harsh winters. Settlers spent weeks smoking meats, pickling vegetables, and drying fruits to ensure a food supply during lean times. This process required careful attention and significant physical labor, often involving the entire family. Candle making was another essential task that occupied settlers' time. Tallow from animal fat or beeswax was carefully melted and poured into molds, with wicks painstakingly centered. This process was not only tedious but also malodorous, filling homes with unpleasant smells. For those settlers engaged in trades or crafts, work was equally demanding. Blacksmiths, for instance, endured intense heat and physical strain as they forged tools and implements essential for the community. Carpenters worked long hours with rudimentary tools to construct buildings and furniture. Even children were not exempt from the constant labor. From a young age, colonial children were expected to contribute to the family's survival. They might be tasked with gathering eggs, feeding livestock, or assisting with household chores. Their education, if any, was often limited to basic reading and writing, learned during rare moments of respite from work. The relentless nature of this work took a severe toll on settlers' health. Chronic pain, joint problems, and premature aging were common. The lack of modern medical knowledge meant that even minor injuries could lead to serious complications, potentially rendering a settler unable to work and threatening the survival of their entire family. Moreover, the constant focus on survival left little time for leisure or personal development. The concept of free time was largely foreign to colonial settlers. Every waking moment was dedicated to work or preparation for work, leaving little opportunity for rest or recreation. This grueling lifestyle also had psychological impacts. The isolation of frontier life, combined with the constant pressure to survive, led to high rates of depression and anxiety among settlers. The lack of social support systems and limited understanding of mental health exacerbated these issues. As we reflect on the working lives of colonial settlers, it becomes clear that their existence was far from the adventurous, romantic ideal often portrayed in popular culture. Instead, it was a constant struggle against nature, marked by backbreaking labor and relentless hardship. The comforts and conveniences we enjoy today stand in stark contrast to the harsh realities of colonial work life, reminding us of the immense sacrifices made by these early pioneers. As we delve deeper into the hardships of colonial settler life, we now turn our attention to the ever-present dangers that lurked around every corner. Life in the New World was far from the promised land many had envisioned, and survival was a daily struggle against numerous threats. One of the most immediate and constant dangers faced by colonial settlers was the harsh and unforgiving wilderness that surrounded them. The dense forests and unfamiliar terrain posed significant challenges to those accustomed to the tamed landscapes of Europe. Wild animals, particularly bears, wolves, and mountain lions, were a constant threat to both settlers and their livestock. Encounters with these predators often ended in tragedy, with settlers losing their animals or even their lives. Settler voice, we lost 3 of our best sheep to a pack of wolves last night. The sounds of their howls still haunt me, and I fear for my children's safety every time they step outside our cabin. The wilderness also harbored poisonous plants and venomous creatures that settlers had never encountered before. Many fell ill or died from accidentally ingesting toxic berries or being bitten by unfamiliar snakes. But perhaps the most insidious danger lurking in the wilderness was the risk of getting lost. The vast, unmarked forests could easily disorient even experienced woodsmen, and many settlers who ventured too far from their settlements were never seen again. Settler voice, my husband went out to hunt 3 days ago. He knows these woods well, but he hasn't returned. I fear the worst, but I must stay strong for our children. Beyond the perils of nature, colonial settlers faced significant dangers from human sources as well. Conflicts with Native American tribes were a constant source of tension and violence throughout the colonial period. While some Native American groups initially welcomed and assisted the settlers, misunderstandings, cultural clashes, and competition for resources often led to hostilities. Raids on settlements were not uncommon, resulting in loss of life, destruction of property, and the taking of captives. Settler voice, we live in constant fear of attack. Every rustle in the bushes, every crack of a twig makes us jump. We've fortified our homes as best we can, but will it be enough? The fear of Native American attacks led many settlers to live in a state of perpetual anxiety, always on guard and never truly at ease in their new homes. This constant stress took a significant toll on their mental and physical well-being. In addition to conflicts with Native Americans, settlers also had to contend with the threat of rival European powers. The colonial era was marked by frequent wars between European nations, and these conflicts often spilled over into the colonies. French and Spanish forces, as well as their Native American allies, posed a constant threat to English settlements. Coastal towns lived in fear of raids by privateers and pirates, while inland settlements worried about being caught in the crossfire of larger military campaigns. Settler voice, we came here seeking peace and prosperity, but it seems we've found ourselves in the middle of a war zone. Will we ever know true safety in this new land? The dangers of colonial life weren't limited to external threats. The settlements themselves were often hotbeds of disease and illness. Poor sanitation, lack of medical knowledge, and close living quarters created perfect conditions for the spread of deadly infections. Outbreaks of smallpox, yellow fever, and other diseases were common and devastating. Entire communities could be wiped out in a matter of weeks, leaving behind ghost towns and traumatized survivors. Settler voice, the fever has taken half our village already. We burn the bodies as fast as we can, but the sickness keeps spreading. I fear we're all doomed. Children were particularly vulnerable to these outbreaks, and infant mortality rates were shockingly high. It was not uncommon for families to lose multiple children before they reached adulthood, a heartbreaking reality that took an immense emotional toll on colonial parents. The constant presence of death and disease created a pervasive sense of fatalism among many settlers. life was seen as fragile and unpredictable, leading to a strong emphasis on religion and the afterlife as a source of comfort and hope. Another significant danger faced by colonial settlers was the risk of fire. With most structures built primarily of wood and lit by open flames, fires were a constant threat that could quickly destroy entire settlements. Settler voice: we lost everything in the fire last night. Our home, our possessions, even our winter stores. How will we survive now? The lack of organized firefighting services meant that once a fire started, it often spread uncontrollably. Settlers had to rely on bucket brigades and desperate measures to save what they could, often at great personal risk. The dangers of colonial life weren't limited to physical threats. The harsh realities of settler existence took a significant toll on mental health as well. Isolation, constant fear, and the struggle for survival led many to experience what we would now recognize as depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress. Settler voice: some days I can barely find the will to get out of bed. The weight of our struggles feels overwhelming, but I must carry on for my family's sake. The limited understanding of mental health at the time meant that many suffering settlers received little support or understanding. Instead, their struggles were often attributed to moral failings or demonic influence, further exacerbating their isolation and distress. As we reflect on the numerous dangers faced by colonial settlers, it becomes clear that their lives were far from the romantic adventure often portrayed in popular culture. Every day was a battle for survival, fraught with risks from nature, other humans, disease, and the very environment they were trying to tame. The resilience and determination of these early settlers in the face of such overwhelming challenges is truly remarkable. Their experiences shaped the character of the emerging nations in the New World, leaving an indelible mark on history. As we close this segment on the dangers of colonial settler life, we're left with a profound appreciation for the comforts and safety of our modern world. The next time you enjoy a meal free from the fear of attack or seek medical attention for an illness, spare a thought for those who came before us, facing unimaginable perils in their quest for a better life. As we conclude our exploration of colonial settler life, it's clear that the romanticized vision of early American settlement often portrayed in popular culture is far from the harsh reality these pioneers faced. The challenges they encountered were numerous, relentless, and often deadly. Let's recap some of the key reasons why being a colonial settler was, to put it mildly, less than ideal. First and foremost, the constant threat of disease loomed over every aspect of daily life. With limited medical knowledge and primitive sanitation practices, illnesses that we now consider easily treatable could quickly become fatal. Smallpox, dysentery, and malaria were just a few of the invisible enemies that stalked the settlements, claiming lives indiscriminately. The unforgiving environment posed another significant challenge. Settlers had to contend with extreme weather conditions, from scorching summers to brutal winters. Many were ill-prepared for the climate they encountered, having come from more temperate regions of Europe. The struggle to build adequate shelter and maintain a consistent food supply was a never-ending battle against the elements. Speaking of food, the constant threat of starvation was a grim reality for many colonial settlers. Crop failures due to poor soil conditions or lack of agricultural knowledge could spell disaster for entire communities. The Jamestown settlement, for instance, experienced a period known as the Starving Time during the winter of 1609-1610, where over 80% of the colonists perished from hunger and related diseases. The relationship between settlers and Native American tribes was often fraught with tension and conflict. While some interactions were peaceful and mutually beneficial, many encounters led to violence and warfare. Settlers lived in constant fear of attacks, while simultaneously encroaching on native lands and disrupting established ways of life. This complex and often tragic dynamic added another layer of stress and danger to the colonial experience. Labor in the colonies was backbreaking and seemingly endless. From clearing land and constructing buildings to planting crops and tending livestock, the work required to establish and maintain a settlement was physically demanding and time-consuming. With limited tools and technology, tasks that we now consider simple could take days or weeks to complete. The isolation experienced by many settlers, particularly those on the frontier, was profound. Cut off from familiar surroundings, family, and friends, colonists often struggled with loneliness and homesickness. Communication with the outside world was slow and unreliable, leaving settlers feeling disconnected and vulnerable. Governance and law enforcement in the colonies were often rudimentary at best. While some settlements had established legal systems, many frontier areas operated under a loose form of frontier justice. This lack of formal structure could lead to disputes, violence, and a general sense of insecurity. Education and cultural pursuits, which we often take for granted today, were luxuries that few colonial settlers could afford. The focus on survival left little time or resources for formal schooling or artistic endeavors. As a result, many settlers, particularly those on the frontier, had limited access to books, music, or other forms of cultural enrichment. Finally, the ever-present specter of death cast a long shadow over colonial life. High mortality rates, especially among children and women in childbirth, meant that grief and loss were constant companions. The psychological toll of living in such precarious conditions, where life could be cut short at any moment, is difficult for us to fully comprehend from our modern perspective. In conclusion, while the colonial period was undoubtedly a time of great historical significance and laid the foundation for the United States as we know it today, the daily reality for most settlers was far from glamorous or enviable. The hardships they endured, from disease and starvation to conflict and isolation, paint a picture of a life that was, in many ways, defined by struggle and sacrifice. As we reflect on this chapter of history, it's important to recognize both the resilience of those who persevered through these challenges and the complex legacy they left behind. The story of colonial settlement is not just one of triumph over adversity, but also a reminder of the human cost of expansion and the often overlooked narratives of those who were displaced or marginalized in the process. As we drift through the annals of history, our journey takes us from the challenging lives of colonial settlers to another intriguing chapter. Let's turn the page and explore a different era, one that's equally fascinating yet often overlooked. Prepare to uncover more hidden truths about the past as we delve into our next historical topic. As we continue our journey through the annals of boring history, let's turn our attention to the bathing habits of ancient Rome. While we often think of the Romans as sophisticated and advanced, their approach to personal hygiene might surprise you. In ancient Rome, public baths were a central part of daily life. However, these weren't the pristine, chlorinated pools we might imagine today. Instead, picture large, communal bathing areas where dozens, sometimes hundreds of people would bathe together in the same water, day after day, without changing it. The Romans believed in the healing properties of water, but their understanding of germs and bacteria was, unsurprisingly, non-existent. This led to some rather unsavory practices by modern standards. For instance, it wasn't uncommon for people to relieve themselves while in the baths. Yes, you heard that correctly. The next time you're tempted to romanticize ancient Rome, remember that you might have been sharing bath water with someone's bodily waste. But wait, there's more. The Romans didn't use soap as we know it today. Instead, they would coat themselves in oil, then scrape it off with a tool called a strigil. This curved metal implement was used to scrape off the oil along with dirt, sweat, and dead skin. Imagine the sound of dozens of people scraping themselves clean. It's enough to make you appreciate your modern shower. Now you might be wondering about the water itself. Surely they must have changed it regularly, right? Well, not exactly. In many cases, the water in public baths was changed only once or twice a week, and when it was changed, it wasn't always with fresh water. Sometimes it was simply topped up. The result was a tepid soup of human filth that people willingly immersed themselves in day after day. But let's not be too harsh on the Romans. They did attempt to keep the baths clean, sort of. Some baths employed a rudimentary filtration system, which consisted of a layer of sand at the bottom of the pool. The idea was that impurities would settle into the sand. However, this sand wasn't changed very often, so it quickly became a breeding ground for bacteria. Despite these conditions, or perhaps because of them, the baths were incredibly popular. They weren't just places to get clean or dirty, depending on your perspective. They were social hubs where people would meet, gossip, and conduct business. Imagine trying to negotiate an important contract while sitting naked in a pool of questionable water with dozens of other people. It gives a whole new meaning to the phrase, dirty business. The popularity of the baths led to some interesting architectural developments. Many Roman cities had multiple public baths, some of which were truly massive in scale. The baths of Caracalla in Rome, for example, could accommodate up to 1,600 bathers at a time. That's a lot of people sharing the same water. But it wasn't just about getting clean. The baths typically included other amenities as well. Many had exercise areas, libraries, and even snack bars. Yes, you could grab a bite to eat after your communal soak. One can only hope they washed their hands first, but given what we know about their other hygiene practices, it's probably best not to think too hard about that. Speaking of food, let's talk about what the Romans used to clean themselves. We've already mentioned oil, but they had other methods too. One popular cleaning agent was something called nitrum, which was a naturally occurring mineral salt. They would mix this with oil to create a paste. While it might have had some cleansing properties, it was also highly alkaline and would have been quite harsh on the skin. For those who couldn't afford nitrum, there were other options. Some Romans used a mixture of ash and urine. Yes, you heard that correctly. Urine. The ammonia in urine does have some cleansing properties, but it's safe to say most of us are glad this particular practice has fallen out of favor. Now you might be wondering about the smell. With all these people bathing together in stagnant water, using oil and urine to clean themselves, surely the odor must have been overwhelming. And you'd be right. The Romans attempted to combat this by burning incense and using perfumed oils. However, given the scale of the baths and the number of people using them, it's likely that these measures were only marginally effective. But let's not forget about the plumbing. The Romans were famous for their aqueducts and sewage systems, and these played a crucial role in the baths. Fresh water was brought in via aqueducts, and wastewater was carried away through sewers. However, the system wasn't perfect. Leaks were common, and the pipes were often made of lead, which we now know can cause serious health problems. Despite all these drawbacks, the Romans were quite proud of their bathing culture. They saw it as a sign of their civilization and sophistication. When they conquered new territories, one of the first things they often did was build public baths. It was their way of bringing civilization to the barbarians. Interestingly, not everyone in Roman society was a fan of the baths. Some philosophers and moralists saw them as places of vice and corruption. They argued that the mixed-gender bathing that sometimes occurred was immoral, and that the baths encouraged laziness and overindulgence. As the Roman Empire began to decline, so did the bathing culture. Many of the grand public baths fell into disrepair or were repurposed. In some cases, they were even used as quarries, with their marble and stone being taken for other buildings. It would be many centuries before Europe saw anything comparable to the Roman baths again. So the next time you step into your clean, private shower with your antibacterial soap, take a moment to appreciate how far we've come. The Romans may have given us many great things, but their bathing habits are probably best left in the past. And with that refreshing thought, let's move on to our next topic of boring history. As we journey back in time to ancient Rome, we find ourselves amidst the bustling streets of the Eternal City. Let's explore the often overlooked and mundane aspects of urban life that made daily existence in Rome a less than glamorous affair. Picture yourself walking through the narrow, winding streets of Rome. The first thing you'd notice is the overwhelming stench. With no proper sewage system in most areas, waste was often dumped directly onto the streets. The infamous Roman gutters, while innovative for their time, were far from efficient. As you navigate through the city, you'd have to be constantly alert. The streets were notoriously dangerous, especially at night. With no street lighting, darkness brought out thieves and muggers. Even during the day, you need to watch out for carts and chariots barreling down the crowded thoroughfares. Speaking of crowds, ancient Rome was one of the most densely populated cities of its time. Most residents lived in insulae, multi-story apartment buildings that were often poorly constructed and prone to collapse. These buildings lacked basic amenities like running water or toilets, making daily life a constant struggle for hygiene and comfort. Water, while abundant in Rome thanks to its famous aqueducts, wasn't as accessible as you might think. Most people had to fetch their daily water from public fountains, lugging heavy containers back to their homes. The wealthy had private water connections, but for the average Roman, this daily chore was a time-consuming necessity. Let's talk about food. While we often imagine lavish Roman feasts, the reality for most citizens was far less appetizing. The poor subsisted mainly on a grain porridge called pools, supplemented occasionally with vegetables, cheese, or if they were lucky, some fish. Meat was a luxury reserved for the wealthy or special occasions. Shopping for food was a daily activity, as most Romans lacked proper food storage. The markets were crowded, noisy, and often unsanitary. Vendors would shout to attract customers, creating a cacophony that would make modern farmers' markets seem tranquil in comparison. Employment for the average Roman was far from stable. Many worked as day laborers, never knowing if they'd have work the next day. Skilled artisans fared better, but even they faced fierce competition in a city teeming with people seeking opportunities. Education, while valued in Roman society, was not universally accessible. Most children from poor families never received formal schooling, instead learning their parents' trade or working from a young age. Those who did attend school faced strict discipline, including corporal punishment for minor infractions. Healthcare in ancient Rome was a mix of superstition and rudimentary medical knowledge. While there were skilled physicians, many Romans relied on home remedies or sought help from temple healers. The lack of understanding about germs and sanitation meant that even minor injuries could become life-threatening. Let's not forget about the constant threat of fire. With buildings constructed primarily of wood and lit by open flames, fires were a frequent occurrence. The city had a rudimentary fire brigade, but their efforts were often futile against large blazes that could destroy entire neighborhoods. Political life in Rome, while celebrated in history books, was often chaotic and violent. Elections were marred by bribery and intimidation. Political rallies could turn into riots, and opposing factions frequently clashed in the streets. Even entertainment, a supposed respite from daily hardships, had its downsides. The famous gladiatorial games and chariot races were often bloody affairs, reflecting the harsh realities of Roman life. These events were also hotbeds for pickpockets and other criminals preying on distracted spectators. Religion, while an integral part of Roman life, added its own set of daily burdens. The numerous festivals and rituals required constant observance, and failing to appease the gods was believed to bring misfortune. This led to a perpetual state of religious anxiety for many Romans. As night fell in ancient Rome, a new set of challenges emerged. With no street lighting, the city became pitch dark. Those who ventured out risked not only crime, but also injury from navigating the uneven, obstacle-ridden streets. Most Romans simply barricaded themselves in their homes until dawn. Sleep, that universal human need, was often disrupted in ancient Rome. The thin walls of insulae offered little sound insulation, and the city never truly slept. The clamor of night traffic, drunken revelers, and early morning traders ensured that a good night's rest was a rare luxury. In conclusion, while ancient Rome was undoubtedly a marvel of its time, daily life for the average citizen was far from glamorous. The challenges of urban living, from sanitation and safety to employment and healthcare, made everyday existence a constant struggle. It serves as a reminder that even in the greatest empires, the mundane aspects of life often define the human experience. As we journey back to ancient Rome, let's explore an aspect of daily life that might surprise you: their diet. While we often imagine lavish feasts and exotic delicacies, the reality for most Romans was quite different. Let's delve into the culinary world of ancient Rome and discover why their diet might not have been as appetizing as you'd think. First, let's consider the staple foods of the average Roman citizen. The foundation of their diet was a grain called emmer wheat, which they used to make a porridge called poules. This wasn't your creamy, flavorful oatmeal. Instead, imagine a bland, mushy concoction that formed the basis of most meals. Bread was another dietary cornerstone, but it wasn't the soft, fluffy bread we enjoy today. Roman bread was often dense, hard, and sometimes filled with debris from the millstones used to grind the grain. Chewing this bread was a workout for your jaw and potentially hazardous to your teeth. Vegetables were a significant part of the Roman diet, but the selection was limited compared to what we have today. Cabbage was particularly popular, along with onions, garlic, and leeks. While these provided essential nutrients, the lack of variety could make meals monotonous. Meat was a luxury for most Romans. The wealthy might enjoy pork, beef, or lamb, but the average citizen rarely had access to these. Instead, they relied on smaller animals like chickens or pigeons. Fish was more common, especially for those living near the coast, but preservation methods were limited, often resulting in less than fresh seafood. Speaking of preservation, let's talk about garum. This fermented fish sauce was ubiquitous in Roman cooking, used to add flavor to many dishes. While it might sound similar to modern fish sauces, the production process was far less refined. Imagine whole fish left to ferment in the sun for months, creating a pungent, salty paste that permeated everything it touched. Fruit was available, but not in the variety we're accustomed to today. Figs, grapes, and apples were common, but many fruits we take for granted, like oranges or bananas, were unknown to the Romans. Honey was the primary sweetener, as sugar as we know it didn't exist. Now let's address the elephant in the room: hygiene and food safety. The concept of germ theory was millennia away, and food preparation practices were far from sanitary by modern standards. Open-air markets, lack of refrigeration, and limited understanding of food spoilage meant that consuming contaminated food was a constant risk. Water quality was another significant issue. While the Romans were famous for their aqueducts and plumbing systems, water pollution was rampant. Many Romans turned to wine as a safer alternative, but this wasn't the fine wine we might imagine. It was often watered down and could be quite sour or even vinegary. Let's not forget about the dining experience itself. While the wealthy might recline on couches in elaborate dining rooms, the average Roman often ate while standing or sitting on the floor. Utensils were limited. Most people ate with their hands or used a spoon for liquids. The lack of forks meant that messy, finger-licking meals were the norm. For the lower classes, many relied on thermopolia, ancient fast food joints, for their meals. These establishments served hot food from large pots embedded in stone counters. While convenient, the quality and freshness of this food were often questionable. Now you might be thinking about those famous Roman feasts you've heard about. It's true that the wealthy could indulge in extravagant banquets, but these were often more about showing off than enjoying good food. Exotic dishes like peacock tongues or dormice were prized for their rarity and expense rather than their taste. Even at these lavish affairs, the concept of food safety was lacking. Overindulgence was common, leading to the notorious vomitorium, not a dedicated room for purging, as often misbelieved, but simply the passage through which guests entered and exited the dining area. However, the practice of induced vomiting to continue eating was not unheard of among the most decadent. For the vast majority of Romans, however, such excess was unimaginable. Many lived on the edge of malnutrition, especially in times of poor harvests or economic downturn. The diet of the poor was heavily reliant on grains and legumes, with little variety or nutritional balance. It's also worth noting that food adulteration was a common practice. Unscrupulous vendors might bulk up their products with cheaper ingredients or use deceptive practices to make food appear fresher than it was. Without modern regulations or understanding of food chemistry, consumers were often at the mercy of dishonest traders. In conclusion, while the Roman diet had its strengths, it was largely plant-based and low in processed foods. It also had significant drawbacks. Limited variety, questionable hygiene, and the constant risk of contamination or adulteration made eating in ancient Rome a far cry from the romanticized version we often imagine. The next time you sit down to a meal, take a moment to appreciate the variety, safety, and convenience of modern food, luxuries that would have been unimaginable to our ancient Roman counterparts. As we journey back to ancient Rome, let's explore the realm of entertainment that captivated the masses. While we might imagine grand spectacles and elaborate shows, the reality of Roman entertainment was often far more brutal and, dare I say, boring by modern standards. One of the most famous forms of Roman entertainment was the gladiatorial games. These bloody spectacles took place in massive amphitheaters, with the Colosseum being the most renowned. However, contrary to popular belief, these events weren't as frequent as movies might have you believe. Gladiatorial games were typically held only a few times a year, often coinciding with important festivals or political events. The average Roman citizen might attend just a handful of these spectacles in their lifetime. And here's a sleep-inducing fact: much of the time spent at these events involved waiting. Imagine sitting on hard stone seats for hours, baking under the hot Mediterranean sun, as preliminary events dragged on. Animal hunts, executions of criminals, and less exciting matches between novice gladiators would fill much of the day before the main events began. The smell of sweat, blood, and thousands of unwashed bodies would permeate the air. Vendors would hawk overpriced, questionable food and drink. It was far from the glamorous affair we often envision. But what about the actual gladiator fights? While some were indeed skilled warriors, many were simply slaves or criminals forced into the arena. The fights were often short, brutal, and not always to the death. In fact, skilled gladiators were valuable commodities, and their owners were reluctant to lose them. When not attending the occasional gladiatorial games, Romans sought entertainment in other, more mundane ways. Public baths were a popular pastime, but these weren't the relaxing spa experiences we might imagine today. Picture crowded pools of lukewarm water, filled with the dirt and grime of hundreds of bodies. The air would be thick with steam and the chatter of gossip. While it was a place to socialize, it was also a breeding ground for bacteria and parasites. Theater was another form of entertainment, but Roman plays were often repetitive and predictable. Most were adaptations of Greek works, performed over and over again. Actors wore large, exaggerated masks and spoke in a stylized manner that modern audiences would find tedious. Comedy performances were particularly popular, but the humor was often crude and relied heavily on slapstick and sexual innuendo. Imagine sitting through hours of predictable jokes and physical gags, with little variation from one performance to the next. For those who couldn't afford or access these forms of entertainment, there were always the taverns. These establishments were far from the cozy pubs we might envision. They were often dirty, crowded, and filled with the pungent odor of cheap wine and unwashed patrons. Gambling was a common pastime in these taverns, but it often led to heated arguments and even violence. The games themselves were simple and repetitive, lacking the complexity and variety of modern casino games. One popular game was called Tailai, which involved throwing knuckle bones and betting on the outcome. Hours could be spent tossing these bones, with little variation or excitement. It was gambling at its most basic and, frankly, boring level. For the more cultured Romans, poetry recitals were a form of highbrow entertainment. However, these events could be excruciating for those not versed in the intricacies of Latin verse. Imagine sitting through hours of poetry in a language you barely understand, delivered in a monotonous tone. These recitals would often go on for hours, with poets eager to showcase their entire body of work. The audience was expected to sit silently, offering polite applause at appropriate intervals, regardless of the quality or interest of the material. Music was another form of entertainment, but Roman music was far from the complex symphonies we enjoy today. Most music was simple, repetitive, and played on basic instruments like the lyre or flute. Concerts as we know them didn't exist. Instead, music was often background noise at other events. For the wealthy, dinner parties were a popular form of entertainment. However, these were often more about displaying one's wealth and status than enjoying good company. Guests would recline on couches, struggling to eat and converse comfortably. The food served at these parties was often more about novelty and excess than taste. Exotic dishes like peacock tongues or dormice dipped in honey might be served, more for shock value than culinary enjoyment. The conversation would revolve around politics and gossip, often devolving into drunken arguments as the night wore on. Sports were another form of entertainment, but they lacked the organization and excitement of modern athletic events. Chariot racing was popular, but races could be long and repetitive, with little variation from one lap to the next. The Circus Maximus, where these races were held, could seat up to 150,000 people. However, the vast majority of spectators would have a poor view of the action, relying on the roar of the crowd to know what was happening. Hours could pass with little to see or do except sit in the hot sun and cheer for colored teams. For children, entertainment often consisted of simple games with sticks and stones, or playing with basic toys like hoops or tops. While these games might seem quaint to us, they could quickly become repetitive and dull, especially for children used to the constant stimulation of modern entertainment. Religious festivals were another source of entertainment, but these often involved long, drawn-out rituals and sacrifices. While the actual slaughter of animals might provide a brief moment of excitement, much of the time was spent in solemn prayer or listening to lengthy sermons. Even the famous Roman orgies, often depicted in modern media as wild, debauched affairs, were likely far less exciting in reality. These events were typically reserved for the wealthy elite and often involved more posturing and political maneuvering than actual pleasure. So as we drift off to sleep, let's remember that while ancient Rome had its moments of excitement, much of daily life and entertainment was far more mundane, and dare we say, boring than we might imagine. The next time you find yourself complaining about nothing good being on TV, just be thankful you're not sitting through hours of gladiator preliminaries or monotonous poetry recitals in ancient Rome. As we conclude our journey through ancient Rome, let's reflect on the stark realities that made life challenging for the average Roman citizen. Despite the grandeur and achievements of the empire, daily existence was far from glamorous for most. The class system in Rome was rigid and unforgiving. While the wealthy patricians enjoyed luxuries and political power, the vast majority of Romans were plebeians, struggling to make ends meet. Social mobility was extremely limited, and most people were born, lived, and died in the same social stratum. Housing conditions for the common folk were abysmal. Many lived in insulae, multi-story apartment buildings that were overcrowded, poorly constructed, and prone to collapse or fire. These structures lacked proper sanitation, running water, or heating, making them breeding grounds for disease and discomfort. Speaking of sanitation, public health was a constant concern. While Rome boasted impressive aqueducts and public baths, the benefits of these advancements didn't reach everyone equally. Sewage systems were rudimentary at best, and waste often flowed through open gutters in the streets, creating a foul stench and contributing to the spread of illness. The Roman diet, particularly for the lower classes, was monotonous and often nutritionally deficient. The staple food was a grain porridge called poules, supplemented occasionally with vegetables, fruits, and rarely meat. Malnutrition was common, weakening immune systems and leaving people vulnerable to various diseases. Medical knowledge, while advanced for its time, was still primitive by modern standards. Many treatments were based on superstition rather than science, and the concept of germ theory was unknown. Simple infections could be fatal, and childbirth was a perilous event for both mother and infant. Life expectancy was shockingly low by today's standards. The average Roman could expect to live only to their late 20s or early 30s. Infant mortality was high, with many children not surviving past their 5th birthday. Those who did reach adulthood faced numerous threats to their longevity, including disease, accidents, and violence. Speaking of violence, crime was a persistent problem in Roman cities. With no organized police force, streets were often dangerous, especially at night. Theft, mugging, and even murder were common occurrences, and justice was often arbitrary and harsh. For many Romans, life was a constant struggle for survival. Work was physically demanding and often dangerous. Slaves, who made up a significant portion of the population, faced even harsher conditions, with no rights and subject to the whims of their masters. Education was a luxury reserved primarily for the wealthy. Most common Romans received little to no formal schooling, limiting their opportunities for advancement. Illiteracy was widespread, further entrenching social divisions. Even leisure activities, which we might assume offered some respite, could be brutal. The famous gladiatorial games, while entertaining for spectators, were a stark reminder of the value placed on human life. Gladiators, often slaves or prisoners, fought to the death for the amusement of the crowds. Political instability was a constant threat. Emperors rose and fell, often through violence, and civil wars were not uncommon. The average citizen had little say in governance and was at the mercy of whoever held power at the time. As impressive as Roman engineering was, it couldn't solve all problems. Natural disasters like earthquakes, floods, and volcanic eruptions, as famously demonstrated by Pompeii, posed ever-present dangers. The Romans' ability to respond to these calamities was limited, often resulting in significant loss of life. In conclusion, while ancient Rome is often romanticized for its achievements in art, architecture, and law, the reality for most of its inhabitants was far from idyllic. Life was short, difficult, and fraught with dangers. The next time you find yourself dreaming of living in the glory of Rome, remember the harsh realities that lurked beneath its marble facades. Perhaps it will help you appreciate the comforts and advancements of our modern world, imperfect though it may be. As we drift through the annals of history, our journey takes an unexpected turn. We leave behind the hardships of colonial settlers and venture into a new realm of historical tedium. Prepare yourself for another captivating tale of monotony as we explore why it was equally unpleasant to be a medieval peasant. Let the dullness wash over you, lulling you closer to sleep. As we delve deeper into the mundane aspects of medieval peasant life, let's turn our attention to their living conditions. Prepare to be thoroughly underwhelmed by the housing situation of these unfortunate souls. Picture, if you will, a structure so basic that calling it a house might be an insult to modern architecture. Medieval peasant dwellings were typically single-room affairs, constructed from whatever materials were readily available in the local area. In many cases, this meant a combination of wattle and daub, a primitive building technique that involved weaving thin branches or twigs, the wattle, between upright stakes, then coating this framework with a mixture of mud, clay, and dung, the daub. The roof, a masterpiece of simplicity, was often thatched with straw or reeds. While this provided some protection from the elements, it also created an ideal habitat for various pests, including rats, mice, and a plethora of insects. Imagine trying to sleep while sharing your roof with a family of rodents, truly the stuff of peasant dreams. Windows, if they existed at all, were mere holes in the walls, sometimes covered with animal hide or cloth to keep out the worst of the weather. Glass was a luxury reserved for the wealthy, so peasants had to make do with drafty openings that let in as much cold as they did light. The floor of these humble abodes was often nothing more than packed earth, sometimes strewn with rushes or straw in a futile attempt at comfort and cleanliness. During wet seasons, these floors would become damp and muddy, turning the entire house into a haven for mold and mildew. Heating and cooking were typically centered around a single hearth, an open fire pit in the middle of the room. While this provided warmth and a place to prepare meals, it also filled the house with smoke. The lack of proper chimneys meant that the interior was often hazy and pungent, with smoke slowly escaping through holes in the roof or gaps in the walls. Furniture was sparse and rudimentary. A typical peasant home might contain a few wooden stools, a table, and perhaps a chest for storing clothing and valuables. Beds, as we know them, were a rarity. Most peasants slept on straw-filled mattresses placed directly on the floor, often sharing these less than luxurious sleeping arrangements with other family members and occasionally their livestock. Yes, you heard that correctly. In some regions, particularly during harsh winters, animals were brought inside to share the living space. While this provided extra warmth, it also added to the already impressive array of smells and unsanitary conditions within the home. Privacy was a concept as foreign to medieval peasants as indoor plumbing. With the entire family, and sometimes extended family, sharing a single room, personal space was non-existent. Every aspect of daily life, from dressing to eating to sleeping, was a communal affair. Speaking of plumbing, let's discuss the fascinating world of medieval waste management. Toilets in the modern sense were unheard of for the average peasant. Instead, they might have access to a communal privy, essentially a hole in the ground surrounded by a flimsy structure for the illusion of privacy. More often than not, however, the great outdoors served as nature's lavatory. For those midnight trips, a chamber pot kept under the bed was a common solution. Imagine the delightful aroma that would permeate the single-room dwelling come morning. The contents of these pots were typically disposed of in the most hygienic manner available, by tossing them out the window or door, often onto the street outside. This charming practice contributed to the overall ambience of medieval villages and towns, creating a unique bouquet that mingled with the scents of livestock, unwashed bodies, and general decay. It's no wonder that perfumes and strong spices were highly valued by those who could afford them. Maintenance of these humble dwellings was an ongoing battle against the elements and the inevitable decay of organic building materials. Thatched roofs needed regular repair and replacement, while the wattle and daub walls required constant patching to keep out drafts and pests. During particularly wet seasons, the daub could become saturated and begin to crumble, leaving gaping holes in the walls. Peasants would then engage in the exciting activity of remudding their homes, slapping on fresh layers of the mud, clay, and dung mixture to shore up their crumbling abodes. The lifespan of a typical peasant house was relatively short by modern standards. A well-maintained structure might last a few decades, but many needed to be entirely rebuilt every generation or so. This cycle of construction and decay was just another thrilling aspect of medieval peasant life. As if the interior conditions weren't challenging enough, the areas immediately surrounding peasant homes were often no better. Refuse and waste accumulated in yards and streets, creating a breeding ground for disease-carrying pests. The concept of urban planning was still centuries away, so villages and towns grew organically, resulting in cramped, winding streets that were often muddy, filthy, and difficult to navigate. In conclusion, the housing situation of medieval peasants was a testament to human endurance and the ability to survive in less than ideal conditions. These simple dwellings, far from providing a comfortable retreat from the hardships of daily life, were instead a reflection of the harsh realities faced by the majority of the population during this period. As we move on from the captivating world of medieval peasant housing, prepare yourself for our next segment, where we'll explore the equally thrilling topic of their dietary habits. But for now, let the soothing thoughts of drafty, smoky, unsanitary dwellings lull you into a peaceful slumber. As we delve deeper into the dreary existence of medieval peasants, let's explore the culinary delights, or rather, the lack thereof, that graced their humble tables. Prepare yourself for a journey through the bland and often unappetizing world of medieval peasant cuisine. The cornerstone of the peasant diet was bread, but not the fluffy, aromatic loaves we enjoy today. No, their bread was a far cry from our modern expectations. Made from coarse grains like rye or barley, peasant bread was dense, hard, and often gritty. The flour used was often of poor quality, sometimes containing bits of millstone that had broken off during the grinding process. Imagine biting into a loaf and feeling the crunch of tiny rocks between your teeth. Delightful, isn't it? But wait, there's more to this culinary adventure. Peasants couldn't afford to waste anything, so they would often let their bread go stale and then soak it in hot water or ale to soften it up. This concoction, known as sops, was a common meal. Picture a bowl of soggy, days-old bread swimming in watery ale. Bon appetit. When it came to vegetables, peasants had a limited selection. Root vegetables like turnips, carrots, and onions were staples. These were often boiled into a thin, watery soup or pottage. Imagine eating the same bland, mushy vegetable stew day after day, week after week. The monotony alone could drive one to madness. Cabbage was another common vegetable in the peasant diet. It was cheap, easy to grow, and could be preserved by pickling. However, the pickling process was far from perfect, and the resulting product was often overly salty or partially rotten. The pungent aroma of fermented cabbage would have been a constant presence in peasant homes. Fruits were a rare treat for most peasants. While they might have access to wild berries or apples, these were seasonal and not always reliable. More often than not, any fruits they did manage to obtain were quickly turned into preserves or added to ale to mask its poor quality. Fresh fruit was a luxury reserved for the wealthy. Speaking of ale, it was the beverage of choice for peasants. Water sources were often polluted, making them unsafe to drink. Ale with its alcohol content was safer. However, peasant ale was a far cry from the craft beers we enjoy today. It was weak, cloudy, and often sour. Imagine quenching your thirst with a lukewarm, slightly acidic, and yeasty beverage after a long day of backbreaking labor. Meat was a rare luxury for most peasants. They might occasionally have access to pork, as pigs were relatively easy to raise. However, the bulk of their protein came from eggs, cheese, and occasionally fish if they lived near a water source. The meat they did consume was often tough, stringy, and of poor quality. It was typically boiled or stewed to make it somewhat palatable. During times of hardship or famine, peasants had to resort to even less appetizing food sources. They might eat bark, nettles, or even clay to stave off hunger. In extreme cases, there were reports of people resorting to cannibalism. The desperation of hunger could drive humans to unimaginable acts. The lack of proper nutrition had severe consequences on peasant health. Many suffered from malnutrition, leading to stunted growth, weakened immune systems, and a host of other health problems. Vitamin deficiencies were common, causing ailments like scurvy and rickets. The constant struggle for sustenance took a toll on both body and mind. Cooking methods were primitive by our standards. Most peasant homes had a central hearth where all cooking took place. Pots would be suspended over the fire, and bread would be baked in communal ovens. The lack of proper cooking utensils and the difficulty in controlling cooking temperatures meant that food was often undercooked or burnt. Spices, which we take for granted today, were an unattainable luxury for peasants. Their food was seasoned primarily with salt, and occasionally with herbs they could forage or grow. The bland, repetitive nature of their meals is hard for us to comprehend in our world of global cuisine and endless flavor combinations. Food storage was another significant challenge. Without refrigeration, preserving food was a constant battle against spoilage. Salting, smoking, and pickling were common preservation methods, but they were far from perfect. Eating slightly spoiled food was a regular occurrence, and food poisoning was a constant threat. The concept of balanced meals or nutrition was non-existent. Peasants ate what they could when they could. Their diet was high in carbohydrates from bread and low in proteins and essential vitamins. This imbalance contributed to their generally poor health and shorter life expectancies. Mealtimes were not the social affairs we often enjoy today. Peasants typically ate quickly and without much ceremony. Meals were seen as necessary fuel for work rather than an opportunity for enjoyment or social bonding. The idea of dining for pleasure was a foreign concept in their world of constant toil and struggle. During religious fasts, which were frequent in the medieval Christian calendar, peasants had to forego even their meager protein sources. On these days, their already limited diet became even more restricted, consisting mainly of bread and vegetables. These periods of fasting, while spiritually significant, often exacerbated their nutritional deficiencies. In conclusion, the medieval peasants' relationship with food was one of constant struggle and compromise. Their meals were repetitive, often unpalatable, and nutritionally poor. The next time you sit down to a varied and flavorful meal, take a moment to appreciate how far we've come from the dreary dining experiences of our medieval ancestors. Their culinary hardships serve as a stark reminder of the progress we've made in food production, preservation, and preparation over the centuries. As we delve deeper into the monotonous existence of medieval peasants, let's explore the tedious and backbreaking work that consumed their daily lives. Prepare to be lulled into a peaceful slumber as we recount the mind-numbing details of their agricultural toil. The life of a medieval peasant revolved around the changing seasons and the never-ending cycle of agricultural labor. From dawn to dusk, their days were filled with repetitive tasks that would make even the most patient person yearn for a reprieve. In the early spring, as the frost began to thaw, peasants would emerge from their humble dwellings to begin the arduous process of preparing the fields. Armed with primitive tools like wooden plows and ox-drawn harrows, they would spend countless hours breaking up the soil and removing stones and debris. The monotony of this task was only matched by its physical demands. Imagine, if you will, walking behind a plow for hours on end, your hands blistered and calloused, your back aching from the constant strain. The oxen would plod forward at an agonizingly slow pace, and you would have no choice but to follow, step by tedious step. Once the fields were prepared, the equally mundane task of sowing seeds would begin. Peasants would walk up and down the furrows, scattering seeds by hand in a methodical pattern. This process required a keen eye and steady hand to ensure an even distribution, lest the crop yield suffer come harvest time. As spring gave way to summer, the work only intensified. Weeding became a constant chore, with peasants spending long hours bent over in the fields, meticulously removing unwanted plants that threatened to choke out their precious crops. The hot sun beat down upon their backs as they moved slowly through the rows, their minds numbed by the repetitive motion of plucking weed after weed. In addition to tending the crops, peasants were responsible for maintaining the common areas of the village. This included repairing fences, clearing drainage ditches, and mending roads. These tasks, while necessary, were no less monotonous than their agricultural duties. As summer progressed, haymaking became a priority. Peasants would spend days swinging scythes back and forth, cutting down grass in sweeping arcs. The rhythmic swish of the blade through the grass was punctuated only by the occasional pause to sharpen the tool. Once cut, the hay needed to be turned and dried, a process that could take days and required constant attention. The arrival of autumn brought with it the harvest season, a time of intense labor that could make or break a peasant family's chances of survival through the winter. From dawn until dusk, they would work tirelessly to bring in the crops before the weather turned. Grain harvesting was particularly labor-intensive. Armed with sickles, peasants would bend low to cut the stalks near the ground, gathering them into bundles as they went. These bundles would then be tied and stacked into shocks to dry in the field. The monotony of this task was broken only by the constant fear of rain, which could ruin an entire harvest if it came at the wrong time. Once the grain was dry, it needed to be threshed to separate the edible kernels from the inedible chaff. This was done by spreading the grain on a hard surface and beating it with flails, long wooden sticks attached to shorter, heavier sticks by leather thongs. The repetitive thud of flail against grain would echo across the village for days on end. After thrashing came winnowing, where the grain was tossed into the air to allow the wind to blow away the lighter chaff. This process required patience and precision, as well as favorable weather conditions. Peasants would stand for hours, repeating the same motion over and over, their arms aching from the constant lifting and tossing. Even as the harvest wound down, there was no rest for the weary peasant. Winter brought its own set of monotonous tasks. There was firewood to be chopped and stored, a never-ending job that was crucial for survival during the cold months. The steady rhythm of axe against wood would become a familiar sound, punctuating the otherwise quiet winter days. Inside their humble homes, peasants would spend long hours engaged in equally repetitive indoor tasks. Women would sit by the fire, spinning wool into thread or weaving cloth on simple looms. The constant whir of the spinning wheel or the clack of the loom shuttle provided a droning backdrop to the dark winter days. Men might occupy themselves with repairing tools and equipment, a task that required patience and attention to detail. The scrape of a whetstone against a blade or the tap of a hammer on wood would join the cacophony of monotonous sounds that filled the peasant's world. Throughout the year, regardless of season, there were always animals to tend to. Cows needed to be milked twice daily, a task that required squatting on a low stool and rhythmically squeezing the udders until the pail was full. The gentle sound of milk hitting the bottom of the bucket would become a twice-daily lullaby for many peasants. Sheep needed to be sheared in the spring, a tedious process that involved carefully cutting away the wool with large, unwieldy shears. Each sheep had to be immobilized and shorn individually, a task that could take days for even a modest flock. Pigs, an important source of food for many peasant families, required daily feeding and occasional herding into the forests to forage for acorns and other wild foods. The monotonous task of preparing swill, a mix of kitchen scraps and other organic waste, was a daily chore that few looked forward to. As we draw this segment to a close, it's clear that the life of a medieval peasant was one of unrelenting toil and mind-numbing repetition. From the endless cycle of agricultural tasks to the daily grind of animal husbandry, their days were filled with work that was as monotonous as it was essential for survival. In our next segment, we'll explore the equally dreary aspects of medieval peasant life beyond work, including their limited diet, cramped living conditions, and the constant threat of disease and natural disasters. But for now, let the rhythmic sounds of thrashing grain and the gentle lowing of cattle lull you into a peaceful slumber, free from the backbreaking labor that defined the lives of our medieval ancestors. As we delve deeper into the harsh realities of medieval peasant life, let's turn our attention to perhaps the most crucial aspect of their existence: health. In an era devoid of modern medicine and sanitation, staying alive was a daily challenge that many failed to overcome. Imagine waking up each morning, not knowing if this day might be your last due to some mysterious ailment or infection. This was the grim reality for peasants in medieval times. Their lives were short, brutish, and filled with constant health threats that we can scarcely comprehend in our modern world. Let's start with the basics: life expectancy. While nobles might live into their 60s or even 70s, peasants were lucky to see their 30th birthday. Infant mortality was staggeringly high, with some estimates suggesting that up to 30% of children died before their first birthday. Those who survived infancy faced a gauntlet of diseases, malnutrition, and accidents that could cut their lives short at any moment. Speaking of diseases, medieval peasants were particularly vulnerable to a host of ailments that would make your skin crawl. The Black Death, or bubonic plague, is perhaps the most infamous. This devastating pandemic swept through Europe in the 14th century, wiping out up to 60% of the population in some areas. Peasants, living in close quarters with poor sanitation, were hit hardest. But the plague was just one of many health threats. Smallpox, tuberculosis, leprosy, and dysentery were constant companions in medieval villages. Parasites like tapeworms and roundworms were common uninvited guests in peasants' bodies, causing malnutrition and weakness. And let's not forget about the ever-present danger of infected wounds in a world without antibiotics. Speaking of wounds, even minor injuries could be a death sentence. A simple cut from a farming tool could lead to sepsis, and broken bones often meant permanent disability or death. Childbirth was particularly perilous, with many women dying in labor or shortly after due to infections or complications. Now you might be wondering, didn't they have doctors or healers? Well, yes and no. Medieval medicine was a far cry from what we know today. Most peasants relied on local healers, who often combined a mix of herbal remedies, superstition, and religious practices. While some of these treatments might have had some merit, many were ineffective at best and harmful at worst. For instance, bloodletting was a common practice believed to balance the body's humors. This involved draining blood from a patient, often using leeches. As you can imagine, this rarely improved matters and often left the patient weaker and more susceptible to infection. Another popular treatment was trepanation, the practice of drilling holes in the skull to relieve pressure or release evil spirits. Surprisingly, some people survived this procedure, but it's safe to say it did little to cure most ailments and likely caused more harm than good. Dental health was another area where medieval peasants suffered greatly. Without proper dental care or nutrition, tooth decay and gum disease were rampant. By middle age, many peasants had lost most of their teeth, making eating difficult and further compromising their nutrition. The lack of understanding about germs and sanitation also contributed significantly to health problems. Open sewers ran through streets, contaminating water supplies. Peasants often lived in close quarters with their livestock, leading to the spread of zoonotic diseases. And personal hygiene was, shall we say, not a priority in a world where survival took precedence over cleanliness. Food safety was another major concern. Without refrigeration or proper food preservation techniques, spoilage and contamination were common. Ergotism, a condition caused by eating fungus-infected rye, could lead to hallucinations, seizures, and even gangrene. It was so common that it was known as St. Anthony's fire. Mental health, while not well understood at the time, was also a significant issue. The constant stress of survival, coupled with poor nutrition and exposure to toxins like lead, likely led to a range of mental health problems. However, these were often attributed to demonic possession or other supernatural causes rather than treated as medical conditions. Now you might be thinking, surely there must have been some positive aspects to medieval health practices, and you'd be right to a degree. Some herbal remedies used by healers did have medicinal properties that we still recognize today. For example, willow bark, which contains salicylic acid, the precursor to aspirin, was used to treat pain and fever. Additionally, some monastic orders developed relatively advanced medical knowledge for the time, maintaining herb gardens and developing treatments that were more effective than those available to the average peasant. However, access to this care was limited, and most peasants had to rely on local folk remedies and superstitions. It's also worth noting that while life was undoubtedly hard, those who survived childhood often developed robust immune systems. The constant exposure to pathogens, while dangerous, did lead to some level of resistance in those who lived to adulthood. As we reflect on the health challenges faced by medieval peasants, it's hard not to feel a sense of gratitude for the medical advancements we enjoy today. The next time you take an antibiotic, visit a dentist, or simply turn on your tap for clean water, remember that these simple acts would have seemed like miracles to our medieval ancestors. In our next segment, we'll explore another aspect of medieval peasant life that might make you appreciate your modern comforts even more. But for now, let the hardships of medieval health practices lull you into a peaceful sleep, grateful for the medical marvels of our time. As we conclude our exploration of medieval peasant life, it's clear that the daily existence of these individuals was far from the romanticized tales often portrayed in modern media. The harsh realities of their lives were shaped by a complex interplay of social, economic, and environmental factors that define the medieval period. One aspect we haven't touched upon yet is the role of religion in peasant life. The church played a central role in medieval society, and this was especially true for peasants. Religious festivals and holy days provided rare moments of respite from the grueling work schedule, offering opportunities for communal celebration and a brief escape from the hardships of daily life. However, the church also exerted significant control over peasants' lives. Tithes, or mandatory contributions of 1/10 of their produce to the church, placed an additional burden on already struggling families. The promise of salvation and the fear of divine punishment were powerful tools used to maintain social order and reinforce the feudal hierarchy. It's worth noting that despite the numerous challenges they faced, medieval peasants were not entirely without agency. Over time, some peasants managed to improve their lot through hard work, good harvests, or favorable circumstances. A few even succeeded in buying their freedom or acquiring small plots of land, though such cases were the exception rather than the rule. The Black Death, while devastating in its immediate impact, paradoxically led to some improvements in peasant life in the long term. The significant reduction in population resulted in a labor shortage, which gave surviving peasants more bargaining power. This led to better wages and working conditions in some areas, though these gains were often temporary and fiercely resisted by the nobility. As we reflect on the lives of medieval peasants, it's important to recognize their resilience and adaptability. Despite the numerous hardships they faced, these individuals managed to build communities, raise families, and maintain cultural traditions that have left lasting imprints on our modern world. The medieval period was a time of great technological innovation in agriculture, much of which was driven by the need to improve efficiency and yields. Peasants played a crucial role in implementing and refining these innovations, from the heavy plow and crop rotation to new irrigation techniques and the widespread adoption of water mills. It's also worth considering the legacy of medieval peasant life in our modern world. Many of our current agricultural practices, rural traditions, and even aspects of our language can be traced back to this period. The rhythms of the agricultural year, the importance of communal support, and the value placed on hard work are all echoes of medieval peasant culture that continue to resonate in various ways today. As we bring this segment to a close, let's take a moment to appreciate the complexity and diversity of medieval peasant life. While it's easy to paint a broad picture of uniform hardship, the reality was often more nuanced. Experiences could vary greatly depending on factors such as geography, local customs, and individual circumstances. Some peasants, particularly those living in more prosperous regions or during periods of relative stability, may have enjoyed a standard of living that, while still challenging by modern standards, was not as dire as we might imagine. Others, facing the combined pressures of harsh weather, oppressive lords, and frequent conflicts, endured truly miserable conditions. In conclusion, the life of a medieval peasant was undoubtedly difficult, marked by hard labor, limited freedoms, and constant uncertainty. Yet it was also a life of resilience, community, and occasional moments of joy. As we drift off to sleep, let's remember that the story of these often overlooked individuals is an integral part of our shared human history, shaping the world we inhabit today in ways both subtle and profound. As we leave behind the challenges of colonial settlement, we turn our attention to another equally mundane yet sleep-inducing chapter of history. Our next topic explores the riveting world of medieval crop rotation techniques. Prepare yourself for a thrilling journey through the fascinating realm of agricultural innovation that's sure to have you dozing off in no time. As we drift back in time to ancient Egypt, let's explore the daily life of farmers along the Nile River. These hardworking individuals formed the backbone of Egyptian society, toiling under the scorching sun to feed the mighty civilization that built the pyramids. The life of an ancient Egyptian farmer revolved around the Nile's annual flood cycle. This predictable event, occurring between June and September, brought rich silt deposits to the farmlands, rejuvenating the soil for the coming growing season. During the flood season, farmers couldn't work their fields. Instead, they were often conscripted for large-scale construction projects, such as building pyramids or temples. This labor was considered a form of taxation, and it was how many of Egypt's most impressive monuments came to be. As the floodwaters receded in October, the agricultural year began in earnest. Farmers would survey their land, repair irrigation canals, and prepare the fields for planting. They used simple tools like wooden plows pulled by oxen to turn the soil and sow their crops. The main crops cultivated by ancient Egyptian farmers were wheat and barley, which formed the staple diet of the population. They also grew flax for linen, vegetables like onions and garlic, and fruits such as dates and figs. A typical day for a farmer would begin before dawn. As the first light of Ra, the sun god, touched the horizon, farmers would already be heading to their fields. The early morning hours were crucial, as they provided a brief respite from the intense heat that would soon follow. Irrigation was a constant concern. Farmers used a clever device called a shada, a counterbalanced lever with a bucket at one end, to lift water from the Nile into irrigation channels. This laborious task required hours of repetitive motion under the blistering sun. As midday approached, the heat became unbearable. Farmers might seek shelter in simple reed huts or under the shade of palm trees, taking a brief respite to consume a simple meal of bread, onions, and perhaps some dried fish. But the work was never truly done. Even during these breaks, farmers would mend tools, weave baskets, or tend to other necessary tasks. The relentless nature of agricultural life meant that idle hands were a luxury few could afford. As the afternoon wore on, farmers returned to their fields, tending crops, removing pests, and ensuring that irrigation channels remained clear. The work was backbreaking and monotonous, but failure meant potential starvation for their families and possible punishment from local officials. Harvest time brought its own challenges. Farmers used bronze sickles to cut the ripened grain, which was then gathered into sheaves. Donkeys or oxen would then thresh the grain by walking over it, separating the edible kernels from the inedible chaff. After the harvest, a significant portion of the crop had to be given as tax to the pharaoh and local temples. Scribes would carefully record the amount of grain produced and collected, ensuring that farmers paid their due. Despite their crucial role in society, most farmers lived in poverty. They resided in small mud brick houses with few possessions beyond the necessities of daily life. Their diet was simple, consisting mainly of bread, beer, a staple drink that was safer than water, and whatever vegetables they could grow. Family life centered around these small homes. After a long day in the fields, farmers would return to their families, often sharing a simple meal together. Children were expected to help with farming tasks from a young age, learning the skills they would need to survive in this harsh environment. Education was a luxury reserved for the elite. Most farmers' children learned through observation and practice, picking up the agricultural techniques that had sustained their ancestors for generations. Literacy was rare among the farming class, with knowledge passed down orally through stories and practical instruction. Religion played a significant role in the lives of Egyptian farmers. They worshipped gods associated with agriculture and the Nile, such as Osiris, the god of vegetation and the afterlife, and Hapi, the god of the Nile flood. Farmers would often make small offerings to these deities, hoping for bountiful harvests and protection from natural disasters. The changing seasons brought different challenges. During the hot, dry months, farmers had to be vigilant against crop-destroying pests like locusts. They developed various methods to combat these threats, including using smoke to drive away insects and building fences to keep out larger animals. Despite the hardships, there were moments of joy in a farmer's life. Religious festivals provided rare opportunities for rest and celebration. The most important of these was the Apit festival, which coincided with the annual Nile flood and celebrated the fertility of the land. As we conclude our journey through the life of an ancient Egyptian farmer, we're left with an image of resilience and perseverance. These individuals, often overlooked in the grand narratives of pharaohs and pyramids, were the true foundation of one of history's greatest civilizations. Their daily struggles from dawn to dusk, year after year, ensured the survival and prosperity of ancient Egypt. As you drift off to sleep, imagine the rhythmic flow of the Nile, the golden fields of grain swaying in the breeze, and the timeless cycle of life along its banks, a testament to the enduring spirit of the Egyptian farmer. As we drift further into the realm of ancient history, let's turn our attention to the lives of ancient Egyptian farmers, particularly their relationship with the flooding of the Nile River. This natural phenomenon, while crucial for agriculture, presented its own set of challenges and monotonous routines. The ancient Egyptians divided their year into 3 seasons, each lasting 4 months. These seasons were directly tied to the Nile's flooding cycle. The first season, called Akhit, was the inundation period when the Nile flooded. This was followed by Perit, the growing season, and finally Shemu, the harvest season. During Akhit from June to September, farmers found themselves in a state of anxious waiting. The Nile's annual flood was both a blessing and a potential curse. Too little water meant drought and famine, while too much could destroy homes and crops. This unpredictability added a layer of stress to the already mundane life of an Egyptian farmer. As the floodwaters rose, farmers were forced to retreat to higher ground, often crowding into villages with their livestock. This period of inactivity could last for months, creating a monotonous routine of waiting and watching. Imagine spending your days staring at the rising waters, wondering if this year's flood would bring prosperity or devastation. When the floods finally receded, farmers faced the back-breaking task of clearing and preparing the fields. The Nile's gift of rich, black silt meant fertile soil, but it also meant grueling labor. Using simple tools like wooden plows and hoes, farmers had to break up the sun-baked mud and remove any debris left behind by the flood. The process of plowing and sowing was repetitive and exhausting. Farmers would spend long hours walking behind oxen-drawn plows, creating furrows in the soil. Then came the tedious task of sowing seeds by hand, a process that could take weeks for larger fields. All of this work was done under the scorching Egyptian sun, with temperatures often soaring above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Once the crops were planted, farmers entered a period of constant vigilance. They had to protect their fields from pests like locusts and birds, often spending long, boring hours scaring away creatures that threatened their livelihood. This meant days upon days of monotonous field watching, with little respite from the heat and tedium. Irrigation was another time-consuming and repetitive task. Farmers used a system of canals and basins to direct water from the Nile to their fields. This required constant maintenance, with farmers spending countless hours repairing and clearing these waterways. The monotony of this task was broken only by the back-breaking labor it required. As the growing season progressed, farmers faced the constant worry of crop failure. Pests, diseases, or unexpected weather could destroy months of hard work in a matter of days. This underlying anxiety added a layer of stress to the already mundane daily routines of tending crops and maintaining fields. When harvest time finally arrived, it brought with it a new set of repetitive tasks. Farmers would spend weeks cutting grain with sickles, a slow and laborious process that required bending over for hours on end. The harvested grain then had to be gathered, bundled, and transported to thrashing areas. Thrashing and winnowing were particularly monotonous tasks. Farmers would spend days beating the harvested grain to separate the edible parts from the inedible chaff. This was followed by the equally tedious process of winnowing, where the grain was tossed into the air to let the wind blow away the lighter chaff. After the harvest, farmers faced the dreaded tax collection. A significant portion of their crops would be taken as payment to the pharaoh and local officials. This system meant that despite their hard work, many farmers lived at a subsistence level, barely able to feed their families after paying their dues. The cycle of flooding, planting, and harvesting repeated year after year, generation after generation. While it provided a stable food supply for ancient Egypt, it also meant a life of repetitive labor and constant worry for the average farmer. The monotony was broken only by religious festivals, which provided brief respites from the daily grind. Even these festivals, however, often centered around agricultural themes. The most important was the Apit festival, which coincided with the annual flood. While it brought some excitement, it also served as a reminder of the farmers' dependence on the Nile's unpredictable nature. As we ponder the lives of these ancient farmers, we can appreciate the stability their agricultural system brought to Egyptian civilization. However, we must also recognize the tedium and hardship that characterized their daily existence. The flooding of the Nile, while vital for their survival, dictated a life of repetitive labor and constant uncertainty. In many ways, the monotony of ancient Egyptian farming life serves as a poignant reminder of how far agricultural practices have come. Yet, it also highlights the timeless challenges faced by those who work the land, forever at the mercy of natural forces beyond their control. As we delve deeper into the monotonous lives of ancient Egyptian farmers, we uncover yet another layer of their daily drudgery, their religious duties. While you might think that spiritual practices would offer some respite from the backbreaking labor in the fields, you'd be sorely mistaken. Religion in ancient Egypt was just as demanding and regimented as the agricultural work itself. Let's start with the morning rituals. Before even setting foot in their fields, farmers were expected to perform a series of prayers and offerings to various deities. The most important of these was Ra, the sun god. Imagine this: you've just woken up, your body still aching from yesterday's toil, and instead of grabbing a quick breakfast, you're required to stand outside your mud brick house, arms raised to the sky, chanting monotonous prayers as the sun rises. This wasn't a quick thank you to the gods. No, this could take up to half an hour of your precious morning time. But wait, there's more. After appeasing Ra, you need to make offerings to Osiris, the god of agriculture and the afterlife. This usually involved setting aside a portion of your meager harvest, yes, the very food you and your family desperately needed, to be left at a small shrine near your home or field. Now you might be thinking, surely that's enough religious observance for one day. Oh, how naive. The ancient Egyptian farmers' spiritual obligations were far from over. Throughout the day, they were expected to mutter prayers and incantations while performing various farming tasks. Plowing, there's a prayer for that. Sowing seeds, another prayer. Harvesting, you guessed it, more prayers. These weren't just empty words, mind you. The farmers genuinely believed that their crop's success depended on the gods' favor. So, they'd recite these prayers with the desperation of someone whose entire livelihood hung in the balance, because it did. But the real kicker came during the numerous religious festivals that punctuated the Egyptian calendar. These weren't joyous occasions for the farmers. Instead, they were periods of increased labor and obligation. During festivals like the Apit festival or the beautiful Feast of the Valley, farmers were expected to contribute a significant portion of their harvest to the temples. Picture this: you've spent months tending to your crops, battling pests, unpredictable Nile floods, and scorching heat. Finally, harvest time arrives and you're looking forward to reaping the fruits of your labor. But then along comes a festival, and suddenly you're required to hand over a large chunk of your hard-earned produce to the priests. It's like paying taxes, but with more ritual and less paperwork. Speaking of priests, let's talk about their role in the farmer's life. These weren't kindly spiritual advisors offering comfort and guidance. No, priests in ancient Egypt were more like celestial landlords, constantly demanding tribute and obedience. They would regularly visit farms to ensure that proper religious protocols were being followed and that offerings were being made. Imagine trying to go about your daily work with a priest hovering nearby, scrutinizing your every move for signs of impiety. Did you forget to mutter a prayer while turning the soil? That's a stern lecture and possibly a fine. Did your offering to Osiris seem a bit on the small side? Prepare for a guilt trip of biblical proportions. But wait, there's more. Farmers were also expected to participate in the construction and maintenance of local temples. This meant that on top of their back-breaking agricultural work and daily religious observances, they now had to spend their free time hauling stones, mixing mortar, or painting elaborate religious scenes. And let's not forget about the mummification process. While you might associate this practice with pharaohs and nobility, even humble farmers aspired to be mummified for the afterlife. This meant setting aside a portion of their already meager earnings throughout their lives to pay for the expensive process. It's like saving for retirement, except instead of a 401k, you're investing in natron salt and linen wrappings. The pressure to prepare for the afterlife was immense. Farmers would spend hours memorizing spells and prayers from the Book of the Dead, believing that this knowledge would help them navigate the perilous journey to the afterlife. Imagine trying to recall complex hieroglyphic texts after a long day of physical labor under the scorching Egyptian sun. It's like studying for a high-stakes exam, but the test is your eternal soul. Now you might be wondering, didn't the gods ever give anything back to the farmers? Well, sort of. Farmers could appeal to certain deities for help with specific problems. Got a pest infestation, pray to Khepri, the scarab god. Worried about the Nile flood levels, Hapi, the god of the Nile, is your go-to deity. But these appeals often came with strings attached, usually in the form of more offerings or promises of future devotion. It's worth noting that not all religious duties were equally tedious. Some festivals did include elements of celebration, like the Festival of Drunkenness dedicated to the goddess Hathor. However, even these ostensibly fun events came with their own set of strict rituals and obligations. It's like being told you have to party, but there's a correct way to do it, and you'll be judged on your performance. As we wrap up this riveting segment on the religious duties of ancient Egyptian farmers, let's recap the sheer monotony of their spiritual lives. From dawn to dusk, their days were filled with endless prayers, offerings, and rituals. Their meager earnings were constantly being funneled into religious obligations, from temple contributions to mummification savings. Even their leisure time was consumed by religious study and temple construction. So the next time you find yourself complaining about having to sit through a long religious service or remembering to say grace before a meal, just be thankful you're not an ancient Egyptian farmer. Their lives were a never-ending cycle of backbreaking labor, punctuated by equally demanding spiritual obligations. It truly puts a whole new spin on the phrase, the opiate of the masses, doesn't it? As we drift further back in time, let's explore the life of ancient Egyptian farmers and their struggles with taxation. While the Nile River provided fertile land for agriculture, the farmers' lives were far from easy, especially when it came to paying their dues to the pharaoh and the temples. In ancient Egypt, the concept of taxation was deeply ingrained in society, with farmers bearing the brunt of this burden. The Egyptian state operated on a system of redistribution, where goods and services were collected from the population and then redistributed by the central authority. At the heart of this system were the hardworking farmers who toiled in the fields along the Nile. The ancient Egyptian calendar was divided into 3 seasons, each lasting 4 months. The first season, Akhet, was the time of inundation when the Nile flooded. During Perit, the growing season, farmers would plant and tend to their crops. Finally, Shemu was the harvest season. It was during this last season that tax assessors would make their rounds, determining how much each farmer owed based on the year's yield. Imagine you're an Egyptian farmer standing in your field as the tax assessor approaches. The sun beats down mercilessly and sweat drips from your brow. You've worked tirelessly all year, battling pests, unpredictable weather, and the constant threat of crop failure. Now, as you watch the assessor survey your land, you know that a significant portion of your hard-earned harvest will soon be taken away. The primary form of taxation in ancient Egypt was a portion of the harvest itself. Farmers were required to give up a percentage of their crops, which could range from 10% to 50% or even more in some cases. This tax was known as the Baku, and it was collected by scribes who meticulously recorded every detail of the harvest and the amount owed. But it wasn't just crops that were taxed. Livestock such as cattle, sheep, and goats were also subject to taxation. Farmers had to carefully manage their herds, knowing that a portion of their animals would be claimed by the state each year. This made it challenging to build up wealth or expand their operations, as any surplus was quickly absorbed by the voracious appetite of the tax system. The tax burden didn't end there. Farmers were also required to provide labor for state projects, a form of taxation known as corvée labor. This meant that during the flood season, when farming activities were limited, farmers could be called upon to work on massive construction projects like pyramids, temples, or irrigation systems. Imagine spending months away from your family, toiling under the scorching sun to build monuments for the glory of the pharaoh, all while worrying about your own fields and livelihood. The ancient Egyptian bureaucracy was remarkably efficient when it came to collecting taxes. Tax assessors and scribes kept detailed records of land ownership, crop yields, and payments. These records were written on papyrus scrolls and stored in government archives. The level of organization was so advanced that individual farmers could be tracked across multiple years, ensuring that no one escaped their tax obligations. For those who couldn't pay their taxes in crops or livestock, there were severe consequences. Defaulting on tax payments could result in imprisonment, forced labor, or even having one's family sold into slavery to cover the debt. The fear of these punishments loomed large over every farmer, adding to the stress of an already challenging existence. It's important to note that not all farmers were equal in ancient Egypt. There was a hierarchy within the agricultural class. At the bottom were the landless peasants who worked on state-owned or temple-owned lands. These individuals had little control over their lives and were essentially serfs, bound to the land they worked. Above them were small landowners who had more autonomy but still faced significant tax burdens. At the top were wealthy landowners who often held government positions and could use their influence to reduce their tax obligations. The temples played a significant role in the taxation system as well. Many farmers worked on land owned by temples, which required them to pay taxes directly to these religious institutions. Temples could be just as demanding as the state when it came to collecting their due, and farmers often found themselves caught between the competing demands of secular and religious authorities. One particularly burdensome aspect of taxation for Egyptian farmers was the requirement to provide for the afterlife of the pharaoh. When a new tomb was being constructed, farmers might be called upon to contribute additional resources or labor to ensure the pharaoh's comfort in the next world. This could include everything from food offerings to luxury goods, all of which had to be produced or acquired by the hardworking farmers. Despite the heavy tax burden, Egyptian farmers did receive some benefits from the state. The government was responsible for maintaining the complex irrigation systems that made agriculture possible in the arid climate. During times of famine or low Nile floods, the state would sometimes provide grain from its storehouses to prevent widespread starvation. However, these benefits often felt small compared to the constant pressure of taxation. As we reflect on the lives of ancient Egyptian farmers, it's clear that their existence was one of constant struggle against both nature and the demands of the state. The fertile banks of the Nile may have provided the potential for abundant harvests, but the reality for most farmers was a life of hard work with little reward. The oppressive tax system ensured that the fruits of their labor primarily benefited the elite, leaving the farmers themselves with just enough to survive and continue their toil for another year. So the next time you find yourself frustrated by modern tax systems, take a moment to appreciate that at least you're not an ancient Egyptian farmer, watching helplessly as tax assessors cart away half of your annual harvest, all while knowing that you might be called away at any moment to spend months building a tomb for a pharaoh you'll never meet. In the grand scheme of history, perhaps our current tax situations aren't quite so bad after all. As we conclude our exploration of ancient Egyptian farmers, it's clear that their lives were far from the glamorous images often associated with this ancient civilization. The backbreaking labor, harsh conditions, and societal constraints painted a picture of a challenging existence that was crucial to the survival and prosperity of the kingdom. Despite the hardships, these farmers played an indispensable role in shaping one of the world's most enduring civilizations. Their toil along the Nile's banks not only fed the population, but also fueled the economy and enabled the construction of the magnificent monuments we still marvel at today. Let's recap some of the key aspects of an ancient Egyptian farmer's life that made it particularly challenging. First, the unrelenting cycle of planting and harvesting. The agricultural calendar was dictated by the Nile's annual flood, leaving farmers with little respite. During the growing season, they worked from dawn to dusk, plowing, sowing, and tending to their crops. The hot Egyptian sun beat down on them mercilessly, while the ever-present threat of crop failure loomed over their efforts. Second, the burden of taxation. A significant portion of their harvest was claimed by the state, leaving farmers with just enough to sustain their families and have seeds for the next planting season. This system kept them in a perpetual state of subsistence, with little opportunity for personal advancement or accumulation of wealth. Third, the constant threat of natural disasters. Floods that were too high or too low could spell disaster for crops. Plagues of locusts could descend upon fields, devouring months of hard work in a matter of days. Droughts could turn fertile land into barren wasteland. These farmers lived with the constant anxiety of forces beyond their control that could destroy their livelihoods. Fourth, the rigid social hierarchy. Farmers were near the bottom of the social ladder, with little hope of improving their station in life. Their children were likely to follow in their footsteps, perpetuating a cycle of poverty and hard labor that spanned generations. Fifth, the lack of modern conveniences. Every task, from irrigation to harvesting, was done by hand or with the help of simple tools and animals. There were no machines to ease the physical burden, no advanced fertilizers to boost crop yields, and no modern medicine to treat injuries or illnesses that resulted from their grueling work. 6. The ever-present danger of wildlife. Crocodiles and hippopotamuses in the Nile posed a constant threat to farmers working near the water's edge. Venomous snakes and scorpions hidden in the fields added another layer of risk to their daily lives. Lastly, the vulnerability to political instability. In times of war or internal strife, farmers were often the first to suffer. Their lands could be ravaged by invading armies, their crops requisitioned to feed soldiers, or they themselves could be conscripted into military service, leaving their fields untended. Yet despite these hardships, the resilience of ancient Egyptian farmers is a testament to the human spirit. They adapted to their environment, developed innovative farming techniques, and persevered through countless challenges. Their story is one of silent heroism, of individuals whose names may not have been recorded in the grand annals of history, but whose collective efforts built the foundation upon which the glory of ancient Egypt rested. As we drift off to sleep, let's reflect on the lives of these ancient farmers. Their struggles remind us of the progress we've made in agriculture and society, but also of the timeless human qualities of perseverance and adaptability. The next time you see an image of the Great Pyramids or the Sphinx, remember the countless unnamed farmers whose labor made such wonders possible. In our modern world of convenience and technology, it's easy to forget the toil of those who came before us. The story of ancient Egyptian farmers serves as a humbling reminder of the hardships our ancestors endured and the debt we owe to their unwavering determination. As we close this chapter of our boring history, may their legacy lull you into a peaceful slumber, grateful for the comforts we often take for granted. As we leave behind the challenges of colonial settlement, let's shift our focus to another period of history that's equally as mundane yet oddly soothing. We're about to embark on a journey through the tedious world of medieval farming practices. Prepare yourself for a riveting exploration of crop rotation, primitive tools, and the thrilling daily routines of peasant farmers. As we delve deeper into the annals of history, we find ourselves in the grimy, smoke-filled world of Victorian-era factories. The Industrial Revolution brought about unprecedented changes, but for the workers toiling in these factories, life was far from revolutionary. Let's explore the harsh realities faced by Victorian factory workers, whose daily existence was marked by grueling labor and dangerous conditions. Picture yourself waking up in a cramped, poorly ventilated tenement, sharing a single room with your entire family. The year is 1850, and you're a factory worker in Manchester, England. As the first rays of sunlight struggle to penetrate the smog-filled sky, you prepare for another day of backbreaking work. Your day begins long before dawn, often as early as 5 a.m. You hurriedly dress in the same clothes you wore yesterday and the day before that. There's no time for a proper breakfast. You might grab a piece of stale bread as you rush out the door. The streets are already bustling with fellow workers, all heading towards the looming factories that dominate the cityscape. As you approach the factory gates, the deafening roar of machinery grows louder. The air is thick with coal smoke and cotton dust, making it difficult to breathe. You join the throng of workers filing into the building, passing under the watchful eye of the factory overseer. Tardiness is not tolerated, and even a few minutes' delay could result in a hefty fine or even dismissal. Once inside, you take your place at your assigned station. If you're a child, and many factory workers were, you might be tasked with crawling under the massive machines to clear away debris or fix jammed components. This dangerous work often led to horrific accidents, with children losing fingers, limbs, or even their lives. For adult workers, the tasks were no less grueling. You might find yourself tending to a power loom, constantly on your feet as you monitor the intricate machinery. The noise is deafening, a constant assault on your ears that will likely lead to hearing loss in later years. The air is thick with lint and dust, coating your lungs and causing chronic respiratory issues. The factory floor is a hazardous place. Unguarded machinery, slippery floors, and poor lighting create a perfect storm for accidents. Burns, crushed limbs, and falls are commonplace. There are no safety regulations to speak of, and injured workers are often simply replaced rather than cared for. The hours drag on endlessly. A typical workday lasts 12 to 14 hours, with only brief breaks for meals. You might be allowed 30 minutes for lunch, barely enough time to wolf down a meager meal before returning to your station. The monotony of the work is mind-numbing, but you dare not let your attention wander. A moment's distraction could lead to a deadly mistake. The heat in the factory is oppressive, especially in the summer months. Temperatures can soar to unbearable levels, causing workers to faint from heat exhaustion. In winter, the chill seeps through the poorly insulated walls, leaving you shivering as you work. There's no respite from the elements. Comfort is a luxury not afforded to factory workers. As the day wears on, fatigue sets in. Your muscles ache, your eyes strain in the dim light, and your lungs burn with each breath, but there's no slowing down. Factory overseers, known as overlookers, patrol the floor, ensuring that every worker maintains peak productivity. Falling behind or showing signs of exhaustion could result in fines, beatings, or dismissal. For women and children, the situation is often even more dire. They're paid significantly less than men for the same work and are often subjected to sexual harassment and abuse. Young children, some as young as 5 or 6, work the same grueling hours as adults, their small bodies struggling under the weight of their tasks. As the workday finally comes to an end, you stumble out of the factory, your body aching and your spirit drained. But your day isn't over yet. You still need to make the long walk home through the polluted streets, perhaps stopping to pick up whatever meager provisions you can afford with your paltry wages. At home, there's little time for rest or relaxation. Your living conditions are squalid, with entire families crammed into single rooms. Sanitation is poor, and disease runs rampant through these overcrowded neighborhoods. You'll need to be up again before dawn, ready to face another day of toil. This cycle repeats day after day, week after week, with little hope for improvement. Factory workers had no rights, no protections, and no voice. Attempts to form unions or protest working conditions were met with harsh reprisals. Many workers found themselves trapped in a cycle of poverty and exploitation, unable to escape the grinding reality of factory life. It wasn't until the latter half of the 19th century that reforms began to take shape. Activists and reformers like Lord Shaftesbury campaigned tirelessly for better working conditions and restrictions on child labor. Slowly, painfully, laws were passed to limit working hours, improve safety standards, and protect the most vulnerable workers. But for many Victorian factory workers, these changes came too late. Their lives were marked by hardship, suffering, and often tragically cut short by the very machines they tended. The next time you enjoy the comforts of modern life, spare a thought for those who toiled in the dark satanic mills of the Industrial Revolution, whose sacrifices paved the way for the labor protections we enjoy today. As we drift off to sleep, let's be grateful that we don't have to face the harsh realities of Victorian factory life. Our next segment will explore another fascinating, if somewhat depressing, chapter of history. But for now, let the rhythmic hum of machinery fade away, replaced by the gentle sounds of your own peaceful surroundings. As we delve deeper into the annals of history, we encounter yet another era marked by hardship and exploitation. The plight of Victorian factory workers, with a particular focus on the disturbing prevalence of child labor. The Industrial Revolution, while heralding unprecedented technological advancements, cast a dark shadow over the lives of countless individuals, especially the most vulnerable members of society, children. In the bustling factories of Victorian England, the air was thick with coal dust and the cacophony of clanking machinery. Amidst this chaos, small figures darted between the hulking machines, their tiny hands performing tasks that adults found too difficult or dangerous. These were not carefree children at play, but rather young laborers, some as young as 5 or 6 years old, forced into a life of grueling work and constant peril. The demand for cheap labor in the rapidly expanding industrial sector led to the widespread exploitation of children. Factory owners, driven by profit and unchecked by adequate regulations, saw children as ideal workers, small enough to maneuver in tight spaces, cheap to employ, and easily controllable. Parents, often struggling with poverty themselves, had little choice but to send their children to work, their meager wages a necessary contribution to the family's survival. A typical day for a child worker in a Victorian factory was nothing short of nightmarish. Rising before dawn, these young laborers would trudge through dark, smog-filled streets to reach their workplace. Once inside, they faced grueling 12 to 14-hour shifts, often starting as early as 5 or 6 in the morning. The factory floor was a treacherous environment, with dangerous machinery constantly in motion, ready to snag loose clothing or limbs. Children were assigned various tasks depending on their size and the needs of the factory. Some worked as scavengers, crawling beneath the massive spinning machines to collect loose cotton. This job was particularly hazardous, as the children risked being crushed or mangled by the machinery above them. Others served as piecers, tasked with repairing broken threads in textile mills. This required quick reflexes and constant attention, as the machines never stopped running. In coal mines, children as young as 5 or 6 were employed as trappers, responsible for opening and closing the underground doors that allowed fresh air to circulate. These children would sit in pitch darkness for up to 12 hours a day, their only company the occasional rumble of coal carts passing by. Older children might work as hurriers, pushing heavy carts of coal through low, narrow tunnels, often on hands and knees. The working conditions were abysmal. Factories were poorly ventilated, filled with noxious fumes and choking dust. Temperatures could be extreme, sweltering in summer and freezing in winter. Accidents were commonplace, with children losing fingers, limbs, or even their lives to the unforgiving machines. Those who survived often suffered from stunted growth, deformities, and chronic health issues due to malnutrition, overwork, and exposure to harmful substances. Education was a luxury few child workers could afford. Most were illiterate, their days consumed by labor rather than learning. The few hours they might have free were often spent in exhausted sleep, preparing for another day of toil. This lack of education perpetuated a cycle of poverty, trapping generations in low-skilled, dangerous work. Discipline in the factories was harsh and often cruel. Overseers, under pressure to maintain productivity, would resort to physical punishment to keep children awake and working. Beatings were common, and children who failed to meet quotas or made mistakes could find their already meager wages docked. The constant threat of dismissal hung over their heads, a terrifying prospect in an era with no social safety net. The plight of these young workers did not go entirely unnoticed. Reformers and social critics began to raise awareness of the horrific conditions in factories and mines. Authors like Charles Dickens, who had experienced child labor firsthand, used their writing to shed light on the issue. Gradually, public opinion began to turn against the practice of child labor. In response to growing outrage, the British government began to implement a series of reforms. The Factory Act of 1833 prohibited the employment of children under 9 years old in textile mills and limited the working hours of older children. However, enforcement was lax, and many factory owners found ways to circumvent these early regulations. It wasn't until the latter half of the 19th century that more comprehensive reforms began to take effect. The Elementary Education Act of 1870 established compulsory education for children, making it more difficult for factories to employ them full-time. Subsequent acts further restricted child labor and improved working conditions, though progress was slow and often met with resistance from industry. The legacy of Victorian child labor casts a long shadow. While conditions in Britain and other industrialized nations have vastly improved, child labor remains a global issue, with millions of children still subjected to exploitative work in various parts of the world. The Victorian era serves as a stark reminder of the human cost of unchecked industrialization and the importance of protecting society's most vulnerable members. As we reflect on this dark chapter of history, we're reminded of the resilience of those children who endured unimaginable hardships. Their stories, though often lost to time, played a crucial role in shaping labor laws and child protection measures that we now take for granted. The next time you pass by a school filled with children learning and playing, remember that this right to childhood is a relatively recent development, hard-won through the suffering of generations past. As we delve deeper into the lives of Victorian factory workers, we must turn our attention to their living conditions. The Industrial Revolution brought about rapid urbanization, with countless individuals flocking to cities in search of work. This influx of people created an unprecedented housing crisis, forcing workers to endure some of the most squalid and overcrowded living conditions in history. Picture, if you will, the typical housing for a factory worker in the mid-19th century. These dwellings, often referred to as back-to-backs, were hastily constructed to accommodate the surging population. These houses were built quite literally back-to-back, sharing a rear wall with another row of houses. This design meant that only the front of the house had windows, leaving the interior dark, poorly ventilated, and prone to dampness. The average back-to-back house measured a mere 100 square feet, roughly the size of a modern-day parking space. Within this confined area, entire families were expected to eat, sleep, and carry out their daily lives. It wasn't uncommon for 6, 8, or even 10 people to share this minuscule space, with privacy being a luxury few could afford. The lack of proper sanitation exacerbated the already dire living conditions. Most back-to-back houses lacked indoor plumbing, relying instead on communal privies shared by multiple families. These privies were often little more than holes in the ground, breeding grounds for disease and vermin. The stench from these facilities permeated the air, making the simple act of breathing an unpleasant experience for residents. Water, a basic necessity for life, was also in short supply. Many workers had to rely on public pumps or wells, often located far from their homes. This meant that every drop of water used for cooking, cleaning, or bathing had to be carried by hand, usually by women and children. The water itself was frequently contaminated, contributing to the spread of waterborne diseases like cholera and typhoid. The cramped living quarters and lack of proper ventilation led to the rapid spread of infectious diseases. Tuberculosis, known then as consumption, was particularly prevalent, earning the moniker the White Plague due to its devastating impact on the working class. The damp conditions also fostered the growth of mold and mildew, leading to respiratory issues that plagued workers both at home and in the factories. Sleep, that most basic of human needs, was a luxury in these crowded dwellings. With multiple family members sharing a single room and often a single bed, restful sleep was hard to come by. The lack of proper bedding meant that many slept on straw mattresses or even bare floors, further compromising their health and well-being. The proximity of these houses to factories and mills meant that workers were constantly exposed to industrial pollution. Soot and smoke from nearby chimneys would seep into homes, coating surfaces and lungs alike. The constant noise from machinery disrupted sleep patterns and added to the overall stress of daily life. For those unable to afford even these meager accommodations, lodging houses provided a last resort. These establishments, often run by unscrupulous landlords, crammed as many people as possible into every available space. It wasn't uncommon for lodgers to sleep in shifts, with one group occupying the beds during the day while another worked, then switching places at night. The concept of home as a place of comfort and refuge was foreign to most Victorian factory workers. Their dwellings were merely places to collapse after long hours of grueling work, offering little in the way of rest or rejuvenation. The constant struggle to maintain even these substandard living conditions added immeasurably to the physical and mental toll of factory work. It's worth noting that not all workers lived in such dire circumstances. Skilled laborers and those fortunate enough to secure better-paying positions might have been able to afford slightly better accommodations. However, for the vast majority of factory workers, overcrowded and unsanitary housing was an inescapable reality. The housing crisis didn't go entirely unnoticed by the more privileged members of society. Social reformers like Edwin Chadwick began to draw attention to the plight of the working class, arguing that improved living conditions were essential for public health and social stability. These efforts eventually led to the passage of various public health acts, which established basic standards for housing and sanitation. However, progress was slow, and for many workers, improvements came too late. The legacy of this housing crisis can still be seen in many industrial cities today, where areas of substandard housing persist as a reminder of this dark chapter in urban history. As we reflect on the living conditions of Victorian factory workers, it's important to remember that these circumstances were not simply an unfortunate byproduct of industrialization. They were the result of a system that prioritized profit over human welfare, viewing workers as expendable resources rather than individuals deserving of dignity and basic comfort. The struggle for decent housing was just one aspect of the broader fight for workers' rights that would shape the labor movement for generations to come. It serves as a stark reminder of the human cost of unchecked industrialization and the importance of regulations to protect the most vulnerable members of society. As we delve into the world of Victorian factory workers, we uncover a grim reality filled with health hazards that plagued their daily lives. The Industrial Revolution brought about unprecedented economic growth, but at a terrible cost to the workers who fueled this transformation. Let's begin with the air quality inside these factories. The atmosphere was thick with pollutants, a toxic soup of chemicals and particulates that workers breathed in day after day. Cotton mills, for instance, were notorious for their cotton dust, tiny fibers that filled the air and coated every surface. Workers inhaling this dust developed a condition known as bisonosis, or brown lung disease. This respiratory illness caused chest tightness, shortness of breath, and eventually could lead to permanent lung damage. The constant exposure meant that many workers found themselves struggling to breathe even outside of work hours. But it wasn't just cotton dust that posed a threat. In metal works and foundries, workers faced the danger of metal dust and fumes. Lead poisoning was common among those working with lead-based products, causing a range of symptoms from abdominal pain and headaches to severe neurological issues. The noise levels in these factories were another significant health hazard. The constant clanging, whirring, and pounding of machinery created a deafening environment. Workers often developed noise-induced hearing loss, a condition that progressed over time, leaving many partially or completely deaf by middle age. The lack of proper ventilation exacerbated these issues. Factory owners, prioritizing profit over worker welfare, often crowded as many machines and workers as possible into confined spaces. This led to stifling heat in the summer months, with temperatures sometimes exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The extreme heat, combined with long working hours, frequently led to heat exhaustion and heat stroke among workers. Fainting spells were common, especially among women and children who were seen as more susceptible to the oppressive conditions. Speaking of long hours, the typical workday in a Victorian factory was grueling. Workers often toiled for 14 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. This relentless schedule led to chronic fatigue, increasing the risk of accidents and further compromising workers' already fragile health. The machinery itself posed numerous dangers. Lack of proper safety guards meant that workers were constantly at risk of getting caught in moving parts. Horrific accidents resulting in crushed limbs, severed fingers, and even death were disturbingly common. Child labor was rampant during this period, and children were particularly vulnerable to these hazards. Their small size made them ideal for crawling under and between machines to clean or repair them, putting them at even greater risk of injury. The textile industry, while a major driver of the Industrial Revolution, was particularly hazardous. In addition to the aforementioned cotton dust, workers in wool processing were exposed to anthrax spores that could lead to a deadly infection known as wool sorter's disease. Chemical hazards were another significant threat. Workers in industries such as matchmaking were exposed to white phosphorus, which could cause a horrific condition called phossy jaw. This painful and disfiguring disease literally caused the jawbone to decay, often leading to death. The lack of proper sanitation in factories added another layer of health risks. Overcrowded workspaces with poor hygiene facilities became breeding grounds for diseases. Outbreaks of cholera, typhoid, and other infectious diseases were not uncommon in these environments. Workers' diets also suffered due to their long hours and low wages. Many subsisted on a diet of bread, cheese, and weak tea, leading to malnutrition and vitamin deficiencies. This poor nutrition further weakened their bodies, making them more susceptible to illnesses and less able to recover from injuries. The cumulative effect of these hazards meant that Victorian factory workers often had drastically shortened lifespans. Many didn't live past their 40s, their bodies worn down by years of grueling labor and constant exposure to harmful conditions. It's worth noting that these conditions didn't go entirely unchallenged. As awareness grew of the plight of factory workers, reformers began a push for changes. The Factory Acts, a series of labor laws passed throughout the 19th century, slowly began to address some of these issues. However, progress was slow and often met with resistance from factory owners who feared that regulations would cut into their profits. It would take decades of struggle and advocacy before significant improvements were made to working conditions. The legacy of this era still resonates today. Many of our modern labor laws and workplace safety regulations have their roots in the hard-fought battles of Victorian-era workers and reformers who sought to address these dire conditions. As we reflect on the health hazards faced by Victorian factory workers, we're reminded of the human cost of rapid industrialization. Their struggles serve as a stark reminder of the importance of worker protections and the ongoing need to prioritize health and safety in all workplaces. As we conclude our exploration of Victorian factory workers, it's clear that their lives were marked by hardship, danger, and exploitation. The Industrial Revolution brought about significant technological advancements and economic growth, but at a tremendous human cost. Despite the grim conditions, workers weren't entirely powerless. The mid-19th century saw the rise of labor movements and trade unions, which fought for better working conditions and fair wages. The Factory Acts of 1833, 1844, and 1847 gradually improved conditions, limiting working hours and setting minimum age requirements for child laborers. However, progress was slow and often met with resistance from factory owners and politicians who prioritized profits over worker welfare. It wasn't until the late 19th and early 20th centuries that significant improvements in working conditions began to take hold. The legacy of Victorian factory workers extends far beyond their era. Their struggles paved the way for modern labor laws, workplace safety regulations, and the concept of workers' rights. The harsh realities of their lives serve as a stark reminder of the importance of fair labor practices and the ongoing need to protect vulnerable workers. As we reflect on this chapter of history, it's worth considering how far we've come and what challenges still remain in the world of work. While most developed countries have strict labor laws and safety regulations, issues of worker exploitation and unsafe working conditions persist in many parts of the world. The story of Victorian factory workers is not just a tale of suffering, but also one of resilience and the power of collective action. It reminds us that social progress often comes at a great cost, and that the comforts we enjoy today are built on the sacrifices of those who came before us. As you drift off to sleep, consider the stark contrast between your comfortable bed and the harsh factory floors where Victorian workers spent countless hours. Let the weight of history settle around you, a gentle reminder of how far we've come and how fortunate we are to live in an era of greater worker protections and rights. In our next segment, we'll explore another chapter of history that might make you grateful for your modern life. But for now, let the rhythmic hum of imaginary machinery lull you into a peaceful slumber, free from the worries and hardships of a Victorian factory worker. Remember, history is not just a collection of dates and facts, but a tapestry of human experiences. Each thread represents a life lived, a struggle endured, and a small contribution to the world we inhabit today. As you close your eyes, imagine the faces of those anonymous workers whose efforts unknowingly shaped our present. Their story serves as a testament to human endurance and the slow but steady march of progress. It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, let this thought comfort you as you drift deeper into relaxation. As we transition to our next historical topic, carry with you the lessons learned from the Victorian era, the importance of compassion, the value of fair treatment, and the power of unity in the face of adversity. These are timeless principles that resonate through the ages, from the smoky factories of the 19th century to the challenges we face in our modern world. Now, as you lie there, feeling the softness of your pillow and the warmth of your blanket, take a moment to appreciate the comfort that so many before us could only dream of. Let gratitude wash over you, soothing your mind and preparing you for restful sleep. In the quiet of your room, far removed from the clamor of factory machines and the shouts of floor managers, allow yourself to sink deeper into relaxation. The echoes of history fade away, leaving only the peaceful present and the promise of a new day to come. As we drift through the annals of history, our journey takes us to yet another chapter of human experience. Let's leave behind the challenges of colonial settlers and venture into a different era, where new struggles and societal shifts awaited those who lived through them. Our next exploration delves into the complexities and hardships of life during the Industrial Revolution, a time of great change and upheaval. As we sail through the annals of history, let's cast our gaze upon the life of medieval sailors, those brave souls who ventured into the unknown waters of the world. Their existence was far from the romanticized tales we often hear, filled instead with hardship, danger, and monotony that could lull even the most restless mind into a peaceful slumber. In the Middle Ages, spanning roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, maritime travel was a necessity for trade, exploration, and warfare. But life aboard these wooden vessels was anything but comfortable. Let's embark on a journey through the daily routines and challenges faced by these hardy seafarers. First, let's consider the ships themselves. Medieval vessels were a far cry from the massive cruise liners or container ships of today. The most common types were cogs, caravels, and galleys. These ships were small, cramped, and often poorly ventilated. The average medieval ship was only about 50 to 70 feet long and 20 feet wide, housing anywhere from 20 to 30 crew members. Imagine trying to sleep in such confined quarters. Sailors didn't have the luxury of private cabins or comfortable bunks. Instead, they slept on the open deck, exposed to the elements, or in the cargo hold among the rats and other vermin. Their bedding, if they had any, consisted of rough blankets or sacks stuffed with straw. The constant rocking of the ship, the creaking of timbers, and the snoring of fellow crew members made for a less than restful night's sleep. The diet of medieval sailors was equally uninspiring. Fresh food was a rarity on long voyages. The staple diet consisted of hardtack, a type of biscuit so tough it often had to be soaked in water or ale to be edible. Salted meat, usually pork or beef, was another common food item. However, without proper refrigeration, this meat often spoiled quickly, leading to frequent bouts of food poisoning. To wash down these unappetizing meals, sailors drank ale or wine. Water was rarely consumed as it quickly became stagnant and undrinkable. The alcohol content in ale and wine helped prevent spoilage, making these beverages a safer option. However, this also meant that many sailors spent much of their time in various states of inebriation. Personal hygiene was another significant challenge. Fresh water was a precious commodity, reserved primarily for drinking and cooking. Bathing was a luxury that most sailors could only dream of. The lack of proper sanitation led to the rapid spread of diseases and parasites. Lice, fleas, and other insects were constant companions on these voyages. The work aboard a medieval ship was backbreaking and relentless. Sailors had to constantly man the sails, adjust the rigging, and pump out water that inevitably seeped into the hull. In stormy weather, which was frequent and unpredictable, the work became even more dangerous. Many sailors lost their lives to accidents, falling overboard in rough seas or being crushed by shifting cargo. Speaking of danger, piracy was a constant threat. The seas were lawless territories, and pirates preyed on merchant vessels and even military ships. Encounters with pirates often ended in violence, with sailors facing the risk of death, injury, or being sold into slavery if their ship was captured. Navigation was primitive by today's standards. Sailors relied on celestial navigation, using the stars and sun to determine their position. However, this method was useless on cloudy days or nights. Many ships lost their way, leading to extended voyages that stretched the already limited food and water supplies to their breaking point. Scurvy, a disease caused by vitamin C deficiency, was a common and dreaded affliction among sailors. The lack of fresh fruits and vegetables in their diet led to this painful condition, which caused swollen gums, loosened teeth, and reopening of old wounds. It wasn't until the late 18th century that the British Navy discovered the link between citrus fruits and scurvy prevention. The hierarchy aboard medieval ships was strict and often brutal. Captains and officers wielded near-absolute power over the crew. Punishments for infractions were severe, ranging from flogging to keel hauling, a particularly gruesome form of punishment where a sailor was dragged under the ship's keel, often resulting in death. Despite these hardships, there were moments of respite. Sailors would often gather to sing sea shanties, tell stories, or play simple games during their off-duty hours. These activities helped boost morale and provided a brief escape from the harsh realities of life at sea. Superstitions played a significant role in the lives of medieval sailors. They believed in sea monsters, mermaids, and other mythical creatures. Many rituals and customs were observed to ensure a safe voyage, such as avoiding whistling on deck, which was thought to summon storms, or having a cat on board for good luck. The length of voyages varied greatly depending on the destination and weather conditions. A trip across the English Channel might take only a day or two in favorable conditions, while a journey to the far reaches of the known world could last months or even years. The uncertainty of return added to the psychological toll on sailors and their families left behind. As we drift towards the end of our exploration of medieval maritime life, it's clear that being a sailor in those times was a test of endurance, both physical and mental. The combination of poor living conditions, inadequate nutrition, constant danger, and prolonged separation from loved ones made it a challenging profession, to say the least. Yet, despite all these hardships, medieval sailors played a crucial role in shaping the world as we know it today. Their voyages led to new trade routes, cultural exchanges, and eventually, the age of exploration that would change the course of history. As you lie in your comfortable bed, far from the rolling seas and creaking timbers of a medieval ship, let the monotony of their daily struggles lull you into a peaceful sleep. Dream of calm waters and safe harbors, knowing that you'll wake to a world made possible by the sacrifices of these long-ago mariners. As we continue our journey through the annals of boring history, let's set sail with medieval sailors and explore their less-than-appetizing culinary experiences. Prepare to be thoroughly underwhelmed by the monotonous and often nauseating diet that these seafarers endured during their long voyages. In the Middle Ages, long sea voyages were fraught with numerous challenges, not the least of which was the constant struggle to maintain an adequate food supply. The medieval sailor's diet was a far cry from the varied and nutritious meals we enjoy today. Instead, it was a bland and often spoiled assortment of provisions that barely sustained life aboard ship. Let's begin with the staple of the sailor's diet, hardtack. This unappetizing biscuit was made from flour, water, and sometimes salt. Baked until rock hard, hardtack could last for months or even years without spoiling. However, this durability came at a cost. The biscuits were notoriously difficult to eat, often requiring sailors to soak them in water or beer to make them even remotely palatable. Imagine, if you will, biting into a biscuit with the consistency of a brick, only to find it infested with weevils or maggots. This was a common occurrence, as insects would often lay their eggs in the flour before the hardtack was baked. Sailors would sometimes eat these protein-rich additions in the dark, pretending they weren't there. How's that for an appetite suppressant? Moving on from the delightful world of hardtack, let's discuss the meat situation aboard medieval ships. Salted beef and pork were common provisions, preserved through heavy salting to prevent spoilage. While this method was effective for preservation, it did little for the meat's flavor or texture. The salt-cured meat was often so tough and salty that it required extensive soaking and boiling before it could be consumed. As if the quality of the meat wasn't bad enough, the quantity was also a concern. Rations were often meager, with sailors receiving only a few ounces of meat per day. This led to a constant state of mild hunger, which was exacerbated by the physical demands of life at sea. Fish, as you might expect, was another important part of the medieval sailor's diet. However, this wasn't the fresh, flaky fish you might enjoy at a seaside restaurant. No, this was typically dried or salted fish, often cod or herring that had been preserved for long-term storage. The process of drying and salting stripped the fish of most of its flavor and nutrients, leaving behind a tough, salty product that was about as appetizing as eating a piece of salty leather. Now let's talk about beverages. You might think that sailors had an endless supply of fresh water at their disposal, given that they were surrounded by the sea. However, storing and keeping water fresh on long voyages was a significant challenge. Water stored in barrels would quickly become stagnant and contaminated with algae and bacteria, making it unsafe to drink. As a result, many sailors turned to alcohol as their primary source of hydration. Beer and wine were common beverages aboard ship as the alcohol content helped prevent spoilage. While this might sound like a perpetual party at sea, the reality was far less exciting. The beer was often weak and sour, and the wine was frequently watered down to make it last longer. The lack of fresh fruits and vegetables in the sailors' diet led to a host of health problems, the most notorious of which was scurvy. This disease, caused by a deficiency of vitamin C, was the bane of sailors for centuries. Symptoms of scurvy included fatigue, muscle weakness, joint pain, and bleeding gums. In severe cases, old wounds would reopen and teeth would fall out. The irony of scurvy is that its cure, fresh fruits and vegetables, was often just out of reach for sailors on long voyages. It wasn't until the late 18th century that the British Royal Navy began to distribute lime juice to prevent scurvy, earning British sailors the nickname limeys. Let's not forget about the delightful world of food storage aboard medieval ships. The damp, dark conditions of a ship's hold were the perfect breeding ground for all manner of pests and mold. Rats were a constant problem, feasting on the ship's provisions and contaminating what they didn't eat. Sailors often had to compete with these unwanted passengers for their meager rations. In an attempt to add some variety to their diet, sailors would sometimes fish or hunt seabirds when the opportunity arose. However, these fresh additions to the menu were rare treats rather than regular occurrences. More often than not, sailors had to make do with their standard fare of salted meat, hardtack, and the occasional bowl of gruel made from oats or peas. Speaking of gruel, let's take a moment to appreciate this culinary masterpiece. Imagine a thin, watery soup made from boiled oats or peas, with perhaps a small piece of salted meat thrown in for good measure. This unappetizing concoction was often a highlight of the sailor's day, providing a brief respite from the monotony of hardtack and salt pork. The lack of proper nutrition and the constant consumption of salted foods led to a host of other health problems beyond scurvy. Sailors often suffered from digestive issues, tooth decay, and various nutritional deficiencies. The high salt content in their diet, combined with dehydration from the lack of fresh water, could lead to kidney problems and other complications. It's worth noting that the quality and variety of food aboard ship often depended on one's rank. While common sailors subsisted on hardtack and salted meat, officers and captains might enjoy slightly better fare. They often had access to preserved fruits, cheese, and even live animals kept on board for fresh meat. However, even these luxuries paled in comparison to the diet enjoyed on land. As we conclude our exploration of the medieval sailor's diet, let's take a moment to appreciate the fortitude and resilience of these men who braved the seas under such challenging conditions. The next time you sit down to a varied and nutritious meal, spare a thought for the sailors of old, chewing on their weevil-infested hardtack and dreaming of fresh fruits and vegetables. In our next segment, we'll delve into another thrilling aspect of boring history. Until then, may your dreams be as uneventful as a medieval sailor's menu. As we drift further into the annals of maritime history, let's explore the harsh realities of discipline aboard medieval ships. Life at sea was already challenging enough, but the methods used to maintain order and obedience were particularly brutal. In the cramped confines of a medieval vessel, where tempers flared as easily as the sails caught wind, discipline was paramount. Captains and officers wielded absolute authority, and their word was law. Disobedience or insubordination could quickly lead to chaos, endangering the entire crew and mission. One of the most common forms of punishment was flogging. This practice involved tying the offender to the mast or a grating and striking them repeatedly with a whip or a cat-o'-nine-tails. The cat-o'-nine-tails was a particularly nasty instrument, consisting of 9 knotted cords attached to a handle. Each strike could leave deep, painful lacerations on the victim's back. The number of lashes varied depending on the severity of the offense. Minor infractions might result in a dozen lashes, while more serious crimes could lead to hundreds of strikes. In some cases, sailors were flogged to death, their backs reduced to a bloody mess of torn flesh. Another dreaded punishment was keel hauling. This horrific practice involved tying ropes around the offender's body and dragging them under the ship's keel from one side to the other. The sailor would be pulled through the water, scraping against the barnacle-encrusted hull, often resulting in severe lacerations, broken bones, or even drowning. Keel hauling was not only a physical punishment, but also a psychological one. The terror of being dragged beneath the ship, struggling for breath, and feeling the sharp barnacles tear into one's flesh was enough to instill fear in even the most hardened sailors. For those who committed more severe offenses, such as mutiny or desertion, the punishment was often death. Hanging from the yardarm was a common method of execution. The condemned sailor would be hoisted up by a rope around their neck, left to dangle and slowly suffocate in full view of the entire crew. Some captains employed even more gruesome methods of execution. Marooning was one such practice, where the offender would be abandoned on a deserted island or coastline with minimal provisions. This was essentially a delayed death sentence, as the marooned sailor would likely die from exposure, starvation, or dehydration. Another horrifying punishment was known as walking the plank. While this practice is often romanticized in pirate lore, it was a terrifying reality for some sailors. The condemned would be forced to walk along a wooden plank extended over the side of the ship, eventually falling into the sea to drown or be eaten by sharks. Even minor infractions could result in cruel and unusual punishments. Sailors caught stealing might have their hands nailed to the mast for a period of time. Those who fell asleep on watch might be suspended in a basket high above the deck, exposed to the elements and the jeers of their crewmates. The harshness of these punishments served multiple purposes. First and foremost, they were meant to deter misconduct and maintain order in the confined space of a ship. The threat of severe consequences kept many sailors in line, even in the face of difficult conditions and dangerous work. Additionally, public punishment served as a warning to the rest of the crew. Witnessing a fellow sailor endure a flogging or other brutal treatment reminded everyone of the consequences of disobedience. This psychological impact was often as effective as the physical punishment itself. It's important to note that not all captains were equally harsh in their application of discipline. Some relied more on their leadership skills and the respect of their crew to maintain order. However, the threat of severe punishment was always present, hanging over the heads of medieval sailors like the sword of Damocles. The brutality of naval discipline during this era reflected the harsh realities of life at sea. Ships were isolated microcosms of society, where the normal rules and laws of the land didn't always apply. Captains had to maintain absolute control to ensure the safety of their vessel and the success of their mission. As maritime law and human rights evolved over the centuries, many of these cruel practices were eventually outlawed. However, their legacy lived on in maritime traditions and the collective memory of sailors for generations. The next time you find yourself complaining about a strict boss or unfair workplace policies, take a moment to be grateful that you're not facing the prospect of keel hauling or flogging. The discipline endured by medieval sailors serves as a stark reminder of how far we've come in terms of workers' rights and humane treatment. As we sail away from the topic of medieval naval discipline, let the gentle rocking of our imaginary ship lull you further into relaxation. The horrors faced by sailors of the past are just that, part of history. Allow the contrast between their harsh reality and your current comfort to deepen your sense of peace and tranquility.